Chapter 385. From Lu Xiaoyi's point of view, the inner and outer swordsmanship competition that was held once every 50 years was a tradition for the inner swordsman to teach the outer swordsman how to behave. The outer swordsman brothers relied on their numbers and were a little dishonest. The inner swordsman brothers would find an excuse to beat them up. For tens of thousands of years, the outer swordsmen had been trampled, educated, and rubbed against without exception. It was a very simple system of drawing lots to determine the winner. The external sword sect had never obtained the final victory. They had never entered the final round. They had never entered the top 4. The best result was that they had entered the top 8 a few times. This was their threshold, and they could not advance any further. This was a grand festival in Xinyuan because the battle was open to all swordsmen, regardless of their level. The goal of the Xinyuan higher-ups was very clear. They wanted the disciples to see what a real battle was and what real swordsmanship was. Through this, they could obviously improve themselves. They could always learn something from it and comprehend something from it. It was a great guide to the perfection of their swordsmanship system. This was something that masters could not teach and could not be found in books. Because there were very few people, only 40 inner swordsmen and 21 outer swordsmen, there were not many battles. After the first round, there were only 30 left. In the second round, there were 15. In the third round, there were 8. The winner would be decided in the 6th round. Short time meant high intensity and competition. Compared to the outer swordsmen's own small competition, they wanted to drag it out for a year and a half. In the end, they were too lazy to even watch it when it was time to fight for the championship. Is it completely random? Lu Xiaoyi asked. Guming nodded yes. But there are seeds. We can't let the strong ones at the top of the ranking meet in the first round. Under the fight of the sword, Qi rushing Heaven Pavilion, the top 10 inner swordsmen and you are the strongest seeds. The top 100 are the second strongest seeds. Yes, they're all inner swordsmen. The rest is random distribution. Little e, the rushing Heaven Pavilion did not give you any tasks in the past 10 years, right? Since that's the case, you have to do your best this time. You can't let us outer swordsmen be disgraced. Can you make it to the top 4? Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. External swordsman hasn't been able to do this for tens of thousands of years, and you're just going to put the burden on your disciples' shoulders? After 10 years, Gu Ming had some understanding of this strange disciple, so he didn't waste any words. Top 4. The outer storehouse of 1,000 Virtues Peak includes all the materials and sword embryos in the official workshop. As long as you like it, you can take it. I don't want a single spirit stone from you. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and asked cautiously, what if I'm first? Gu Ming smiled slyly. He had been waiting for this sentence. Firstly, Qinshou Peak's treasury will be open to you. You can take whatever you want. You should know that only Jin Dan and even Yuanying are qualified to use the sword embryo and materials there. Lu Xiaoyi could not help but be tempted by such a huge temptation. He also knew that he could no longer keep a low profile. He would use this internal and external sword battle as the starting point for his rise. He was qualified to be the strongest seed, although his qualifications were a little forced. 10 years ago, when the 5th Ring Foundation establishment ranking had placed him at 11th place, it had been 3 times since then. However, his 11th place had not budged at all. The matter was obvious. The person who made the ranking firmly believed that he had top-notch strength. As long as he performed a little, he would be able to enter the top 10. Therefore, his 11th place was unshakable. This was a kind of appreciation. He was very curious. What was the reason why the person who made the ranking thought so highly of him? Martial Uncle, who was the person who made this ranking? What kind of power did it? Has there never been a deviation before? Gu Ming smiled. Of course there have been deviations. However, the so-called ranking is a place where the strong survive and the weak are eliminated. Young people strive to catch up, and the younger generation surpasses the older generation. Isn't that normal? Within the top 10 ranks, it doesn't mean that those who are ranked at the top will be able to defeat those behind them. What they lack is an opportunity to perform a moment of glory. This is why the ranking is divided into several levels. the top 10, the top 30, and the top 100. The general gap in strength is still accurate. No one doubts it, except for you. Lu Xiaoyi ignored his attack. I remember that there are 2 inner swordsmen who are ranked in the top 10. Gu Ming's face was full of helplessness. Your information is outdated. One of them has already been promoted to Jin Dan. Moreover, he entered the Jin Dan ranking in the 3rd year after he was promoted to Jin Dan. Such a person, Sai. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to get to the bottom of this, because this concerned his opponent. Which one? Gu Ming looked at this disciple who was theoretically the strongest in the outer sword. He knew what this kid meant. He was asking who his opponent would be in the end. Did he really want to fight for first place? Although it was a little arrogant, it was normal for a swordsman. However, the rule in Xiongding was that the inner swordsman would always fight for first place, while the outer swordsman would always fight for second place. It's glorious light. Lu Xiaoyi understood. He did not care about the ranking, but even if he did not care, there were countless people around him who talked about it every day. Especially his senior sister, he knew a lot from her nagging. There were 2 strongest inner swordsmen in Xinyuan. Glorious Light was ranked 2nd, and Bright Light was ranked 9th. He was the leader of the entire Xinyuan Foundation establishment group. He was the real eldest senior brother, not only in the inner sword, but also in the outer sword. He was not like Lu Xiaoyi, who had closed the door to the outer sword. Gu Ming continued, "It's not just him. In fact, among the people who have always been in the top 10 of the Foundation establishment ranking, a total of 4 have been promoted to Jin Dan, including the top 3 and the other one. Therefore, this year's top 10 has changed a lot. Everyone says that this year's batch is slightly weaker than before. However, this has nothing to do with you. You just need to focus on your own cultivation and get a good result in the inner and outer sword battles to bring glory to our outer sword. After that, you still have 10 years to sharpen yourself. I see that you've already reached the peak of the middle stage, and you're only a step away from the late stage. Compared to the time you took to enter the sect, this kind of progress can't be considered amazing, but it's still considered very fast." Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat curious. What's the fastest time to reach the late stage? Gu Ming glanced at him. As elders, we usually don't talk about these things because it'll affect a lot of people. In fact, how fast one's cultivation grows after the foundation establishment stage doesn't determine whether a cultivator has a chance to form their gold core or not. Of course, there are definitely more chances. However, for you, it doesn't matter if you know about these things. They shouldn't create obstacles for your temperament. You need to set a goal for yourself. Let's not talk about history. There are too many coincidences. There are those who entered the Jin Dan before they entered the foundation establishment stage, and then they exploded and died. Let's just talk about now. Glorious Light reached the late stage 30 years after the foundation establishment stage. Bright Light took 40 years, which is your current time. Therefore, you see, in fact, compared to them, your speed is very ordinary. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. A genius was a genius. In fact, other than his unique ability to produce the sword spirit of a flying sword, he was really very ordinary in other aspects. This was what he thought, but in reality, there were many things that he couldn't see from his position. It was like darkness under the light. For example, the talent to kill. To him, this was a very normal choice, but it was a realm that others couldn't reach in their lifetime. To a swordsman, was there anything more important than this? Chapter 386. P.S. I finally repaid my debt. Let's go for a drink tonight. Do you have a monthly ticket to go with my wine? The arena for the inner and outer sword duels was set on the snowy plains below the hidden sword peak. The reason why it was set on the outer sword's territory was because there were too many spectators. There were more than 20,000 Foundation establishment cultivators. Excluding those who were on guard duty outside, those who were out on missions, those who were traveling, those who were in seclusion, and those who weren't interested, there were at least 10,000 of them. Of course, there were no tables, chairs, melon seeds, or tea. Everyone was scattered on the snowy plains. Above their heads was a huge little world. It was transparent, and other than a faint light shield that proved that there was a little world here, there were no other obstacles. The space was dozens of miles wide. It was much bigger than Lu Xiaoyi's battle barrier on Fangting Island. This was a swordsman's specialty. They had to be given enough space to move around in order to display their swordsmanship. Unlike the cultivators of the Three Pure Ones, they couldn't wait to shrink the space to the size of a cage so that the swordsman couldn't run. What surprised Lu Xiaoyi the most was that there were two perfected masters presiding over the duels. One was an inner sword cultivator, and the other was an outer sword cultivator. It was normal that he didn't recognize them. The range of activities of small foundation establishment cultivators, like him, was completely different from the upper-level perfected masters. In fact, the inner and outer sword duels were small matters to the upper levels of Xianyuan. They weren't worth paying attention to. The reason why they sent perfected masters to preside over the duels was that only perfected masters could display the full power of the foundation establishment cultivators. They didn't need to be timid and afraid of everything. Once swordsmen had misgivings about fighting, there was no way they could fight. Jin Dan wasn't as good in this aspect. In order to avoid real casualties, they didn't dare to let their flying swords get too close to the cultivators. If they interfered too early, it would affect the outcome and cause injustice. They were all Xuanyuan's best seeds. If they died in their own sex sword duels, it would be a joke if word got out. Lu Xiaoyi found a familiar face among the inner sword cultivators. Yinbo. This guy was also in the ranking. He didn't even tell him about his senior sister. Needless to say, he must have felt that his ranking couldn't be compared to Lu Xiaoyi's, so he simply didn't say anything. He was willing to suffer because he wanted to save face. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care about that and directly walked over. Senior brother, what you up to? Sneaking around like this. Yinbo was embarrassed. Hurry up and leave. Nothing good ever happens when I see you. Remember, be careful when you draw lots. If you draw me, we'll break off our friendship. Yinbo still didn't want to fight with his former junior brother. If he lost, it would be too shameful. The other external swordsmen were much easier to deal with. Only this brat was too sinister. He was too scheming when fighting. Lu Xiaoyi was the only one who walked over to greet him before the battle started. The other external swordsmen were more cautious. They stood solemnly and gathered their momentum for the upcoming battle. Everyone wanted to change history, but imagination and reality were always incomparably contradictory. Among the two swordsmen, the inner sword was in charge of hosting the battle, while the outer sword was in charge of drawing lots. Because the number of inner swordsmen was twice as high as the number of outer swordsmen on the ranking, there were still 22 inner swordsmen who needed to compete with their fellow inner swordsmen. There was no other way. Who asked the outer swordsmen to be so weak? Xuanyuan's tradition was very straightforward. The pace was very fast, and there were no formalities. Once everyone was present, the outer swordsmen immediately began to draw lots. At this time, the snowy plains of Hidden Sword Peak were already crowded with people. Lu Xiaoyi was the strongest seed. This also meant that he would definitely draw an inner sword cultivator who was ranked at the bottom. From this point of view, the probability of him going up against Yin Bo wasn't small. It was just that he felt a little embarrassed. Cultivators were very open-minded about this. Everyone here was a fellow disciple. Unless you didn't go up, you had to be mentally prepared to face a familiar face. However, Lu Xiaoyi's luck still followed probability. His opponent was an unfamiliar outer sword cultivator, Guangzhu. He was an old foundation establishment cultivator who was ranked around 600. Based on his ranking alone, he was even above Yin Bo. The first round thus began. The speed was just as shocking. If it was another sect that held a similar internal competition, there would definitely be dozens or even dozens of battle arenas. This was especially true for Dharma Meridians. Because of the dragging and slow pace, rather than calling it a battle, it would be better to call it a mutual discussion of the Tao. In the cultivation world, among the main orthodoxies, the battle between Dharma cultivators was the slowest. Swordsman's battle was the shortest. This was a publicly acknowledged fact. In the words of body cultivators, one raised but not firm, the other drained like a waterfall. Of course, due to the fact that body cultivators would often transform into their Dharma forms and cause earth-shattering battles, Dharma cultivators, and swordsmen's evaluation of body cultivators' battles was that they were too congested and couldn't enter the right path. The battle between orthodoxies was the main theme of the cultivation world. It had never stopped since the beginning of cultivation. They weren't wrong to say that a swordsman's ability to vent was like a waterfall. Close, attack, clash, fly apart in mouth. This was the norm. 1, 2, 3, pay the bill. It was reasonable for the sect to only arrange this space. Everyone was doing this, and Lu Xiaoyi was no exception. He understood the significance of everyone's competition. To be honest, those who were able to stand here were all veterans of hundreds of battles. Whether it was between fellow sect members or against other orthodoxies, they had fought countless battles, especially between fellow sect members who had fought for at least 100 years. They knew each other's skills very well. Furthermore, it was not appropriate for them to play dirty in front of everyone. Therefore, everyone agreed to compete in the most basic aspects: range, sword speed, sword frequency, power, control, reaction. This kind of competition was the most exciting when both parties were in close contact. If the range was shorter, the speed of the sword would be slower, the frequency of the sword would be slower, the power would be weaker, the control would be cruder, and the reaction would be slower. Manipulating the sword was not only the essence of the inner sword, it was also the only way to use the outer sword. When two sword cultivators manipulated the sword, there were countless ways to manipulate it. Kiting, biting tails, circling, secret techniques, teleporting, swaying, colliding. It was impossible to predict what kind of trajectory two fast-moving humans could create in a vast space. However, there was one thing. The most thrilling, most exciting, most direct, and fastest way to solve the problem was to collide. This was also the most important test of a swordsman's courage and reaction to an enemy. There was no hard and fast standard. When both parties collided, starting from 3 or 4,000 feet away, how many swords would you send out? How many moves would you send out? How would you attack or defend? How would you counter? If 3 or 4,000 feet could not be separated, then 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. The rhythm became faster and faster. The number of flying swords increased, and the distance became shorter and shorter. It was purely based on instincts, and there was no room for thought. The result would be that I'm standing, and you're falling. I'm the standard. This was the real scene of a Xianyuan swordsman's internal competition. They disdained trickery and loved to lick the blood on the tip of their blade, dancing on the edge of the blade. This was the core of a swordsman's strength. This was also the reason why swordsmen's battle records were so brilliant. They were better at fighting on the front lines. Chapter 387. To Lu Xiaoyi, this kind of fighting style had both advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was that he couldn't use any of his sneaky tactics, but the advantage was that his flying sword was a powerful single sword. His attention was focused on Guangming, who was also his last opponent. If he didn't drop the ball midway, then according to the division of the strongest seed, they would only meet at the end. Guangming seemed to be very relaxed when facing his opponent. As he approached quickly, he casually erased his opponent's attack and casually sent out a few sword strikes. Just like that, he casually sent his opponent out of the battle. In his carelessness, he showed great confidence. That external sword expert couldn't even arouse his desire to fight. A terrifying opponent wasn't because of his imposing manner, but because of his leisurely stroll. What he didn't know was that when he appeared, he would become the focus of all the swordsmen in the snowfield. The strength of the inner sword had been going on for tens of thousands of years. It was so strong that people didn't feel it at all. It was natural, and there was no sense of novelty or anticipation. However, he was different. He was the representative of the outer sword's counterattack. Moreover, he was low-key and rarely showed himself in public. Therefore, he attracted the curiosity of everyone, including the outer sword and the inner sword. They were curious as to how he managed to climb to the 11th place without fighting with the previous ranking. Would this battle between the inner and outer swords in Xianyuan be the downfall of this new outer sword senior brother? Of course, All the participating swordsmen were also paying attention to him. Whether it was the inner sword or the outer sword, none of them had really seen him compete with others. They needed to establish a benchmark, a position, so that they could know their own position in the upcoming battle. Lu Xiaoyi didn't fight for a position. When the battle space was large enough, it didn't matter if you fought or not. Because no matter how fast you were, you couldn't be fast enough to force your opponent against the wall of space. This was completely different from the battle space on Fonting Island. He maintained a medium speed so that he could launch a thunderous attack from the best position. He didn't want to hide anymore. He couldn't hide his true strength on a stage like Xianyuan. It was too childish to try to hide his true strength and become number one. After crossing 400 feet, the Four Seasons sword suddenly flew out as fast as lightning. He didn't have any thoughts of using the second flying sword. Since he was going to fight, then he would fight cleanly. This kind of shooting range was the best among all the participants present. At least he had shown it, while Light had yet to fully display his abilities. The flight of the Four Seasons seemed to follow some kind of mysterious trajectory. It was as if they had taken a long detour, but it also didn't seem to affect the approach of the flying swords at all. However, this mysterious trajectory faintly revealed a kind of domain of power. Sheephorn. All the spectators could see that this person was really arrogant. He actually used the swordsmanship of an inner sword to deal with an inner sword. Guangzhou was still calm, as if he hadn't seen his opponent's long range at all. So what if it was a long journey? It only meant that he would be the first to be attacked. If he managed to block his opponent's attack and entered the range of 300 feet, everyone would be within his shooting range. What was the point of talking about distance? He did not have a good impression of this external swordsman. He thought that he was a little silly and had a slow mind. Since he was good at long-range attacks, then of course he had to increase the distance between him and his opponent. Why did he have to learn how to fight head-on? Collision was just one of the methods, and no one said that it had to be this way. Playing to one's strengths and avoiding one's weaknesses was the true essence of a swordsman, and not following the crowd blindly. Both parties quickly closed in. Before they entered the range of 300 feet, Guangzhou had already sent out his sword light. It wasn't to intercept, but to attack. The confidence of an external swordsman was already rooted in his blood. Whether it was his senior or junior brother didn't mean much to him. To him, it was just an external swordsman, and that was it. He still used the method of dealing with an external swordsman to deal with him, and continued to attack. Although the flying swords had already exceeded his shooting range, don't forget that both parties were quickly closing in. The three sword lights were his warning to his opponent as an internal swordsman. There had never been an internal swordsman who completely defended against an external swordsman. This was a tradition that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years, and it was not to be challenged. After that, he began to organize his own defense. A swordsman's defense was divided into 3 layers. Long-range flying swords to intercept, close-range escaping techniques to dodge, and finally, his body to resist. He didn't want to bleed himself, and he didn't want to retreat in such a collision. That was the choice of the week, so he could only choose to intercept with his flying swords. His opponent's flying sword was already close to 200 feet. Considering the relative speed, he had less than 2 breaths of time to send out at least 20 sword lights. That was enough. When the first sword light was sent out, his opponent's flying sword moved in a mysterious way and missed. The second sword light was also missed. The third sword light was accurately hit after some adjustments, but his sword light was like an ant trying to shake a tree in front of his opponent's physical sword. It didn't have any effect. In the blink of an eye, 10 sword lights were intercepted, but they didn't have any effect. This time, Guangzhou was serious. He had no choice but to be serious. If he couldn't block this sword, he would lose. Because the distance was very close, the sword light that followed collided with his opponent's flying sword without missing a beat. It was only at this moment that he truly felt the strength of his opponent's flying sword. It was an unshakable strength. Using all his strength, he sent out another 11 sword lights. When his opponent's flying sword was within 10 feet of him, his flying sword system was declared ineffective. All that was left was to resist while dodging. But his opponent's flying sword was unusually nimble, and his spiritual sense was firmly locked on. There was no chance. The moment the flying sword pierced his body, an indescribable power suddenly descended. The four seasons stopped a few inches in front of his chest. The host of the inner sword, Immortal, shouted, "This battle, cigarette stub wins, Guangzhou loses." Lu Xiaoyi bowed and left the field. Thunderous cheers came from the snowy plains below. They had already fought more than 20 battles. Basically, the battles ended quickly, but those who fell were all external swords. The only external swords that won were still fighting fiercely without any excitement, until the Shixiang came out and solved the problem with one sword. This was the crushing of strength. Before, it was always the internal swords that crushed the external swords. Now, there was finally an external sword that could crush the internal swords. What did this mean? It meant that the external swords were still promising and not useless. There were also ripples in the group of internal swords. Guangzhou returned to his fellow disciples without saying a word. He had lost face and had no face to defend himself. But as to Shixiang, Guang comforted him, "Don't take it to heart. It's not easy for the external swords to have talents. We should be happy for them. Be more open-minded. If the external swords had a group of people with such strength, we would have a lot less trouble." Guangzhou then spoke. "That external sword is too heavy. I feel that it's not just the addition of the sheep horn technique. There should be something else." Guang said seriously, "This person is able to rank 11th on the ranking list. He's not someone with an undeserved reputation. His sheep horn technique is not worth mentioning. It's just the beginning of this path. It's far from being profound. The reason why the sword is heavy is because the flying sword has a spirit. You all have to be careful about this." The internal swords looked at each other. The external sword had a sword spirit in the Zhuji stage. No wonder this person's ranking rose so quickly. Chapter 388. Lu Xiaoyi returned to the group of outer swords. Along the way, every outer sword nodded in greeting. Although no one called him senior brother, their subtle actions showed the subtle changes in their hearts. Swordsmen were like this. Strength was the most important thing. If you were capable, nothing else mattered. He did not hold back in this attack. It was normal that Guangzhou could not block it. It would be abnormal if he could. 10 years, a whole 10 years. The four-seasoned sword spirits could already surpass the 5 gates on Bo Lang's slope. The strength of the sword spirits brought about the strength of the flying swords. The four seasons flying sword formation had already been recorded to the 14th level. It had already far exceeded the upper limit of the foundation establishment stage sword technique. The imbalance of 37 had now developed to 28. The direct result was the abnormal penetrative power of the first sword. The only thing he did not use was the star sword force that he was best at. He chose the sheep horn technique that he had just comprehended. He hoped that in the following battles, he could rely on consecutive victories to achieve the goal of comprehending the force of might. It would be best to accumulate this force for the final battle and display its power in the battle against the light. All of these needed to be won in one strike. He could not hide it any longer. Amidst the excitement of the outer swords below, the first round ended quickly. From the overall results, only 4 of the 21 outer swords were left. But this time, the outer swords had something to look forward to, not as a whole, but as individuals. Half of the 64 outer swords were eliminated, leaving 32 outer swords. Lu Xiaoyi drew Guang Kun, an inner swordsman ranked within the top 300. The outer swordsman's draw was very fair. It was so fair that Lu Xiaoyi did not have the slightest bit of surprise. When it was Lu Xiaoyi's turn, everyone knew that this was a real battle to test his abilities. This was because the swordsman opposite him would no longer treat him as an outer swordsman, but as an outer swordsman ranked 11th on the ranking. Different judgments of strength would lead to different tactical responses. This time, there was no luck to speak of. Lu Xiaoyi still attacked from 4,000 feet away. But this time, his opponent did not attack him. Instead, he chose to defend first. The inner swordsman also wanted to know how heavy his sword was. Was it able to break through Zhu Guangzhu's defense just now? But did he still have strength to spare? Guang Kuan had tested it, and it was heavy without a ceiling. Even if he used all of his strength to defend against the flying sword, he would not be able to effectively intercept it. It was still a single sword. Taoist master Inner Sword announced the result. This result proved that the internal sword's plan of using this method to end the battle had failed. If this continued, other than light, none of the other internal swords dared to say that they had the confidence to receive this sword. Changing the method and truly moving the sword showed that the inner sword had lost a lot of confidence in front of him. Psychologically, he had already established his own advantage. Down below, there was a large group of cultivators who belonged to the cultivators of the outer realm. Ling Ruofeng was among them, sighing. They're all from the same place. They were all practicing swordsmanship at the same time. Why do I feel like I'm practicing needles while little E is practicing hammers? Why is the difference so huge? It doesn't make sense. The person beside him laughed. The key is the name. Look at eldest senior brother's Buddhist name, Cigarette, but the head of the smoke generation. This name is not normal. Ruofeng, you were too careless when you chose your name. How could you miss out on such a good name? If it really doesn't work, Smoke's fart will do too. The external sword saw hope. Up until now, the situation had gradually become clear. It was hard to say about the other external sword senior brothers, but eldest senior brother Cigarette would definitely enter the front ranks. The biggest question was, how far would he go? The external swords, Jin Dan, looked at the problem differently. Gu Shan, who had always been tireless in teaching, frowned. Little Yi's flying sword has almost reached the pinnacle of foundation establishment. In this aspect, even light is inferior. But a battle is not just about the distance and weight of the sword. Once the two sides choose to move their swords back and forth, such a heavy sword may not be able to find an opportunity. Everyone nodded. Compared to external swords, the internal sword would always be inferior in terms of weight. This was the difference between a physical sword and sword energy. The physical would always be greater than the virtual. But the internal sword had another advantage, and that was the frequency of the sword. When both sides were within the shooting range, the internal sword's frequency could reach the level of 10 swords in a breath. For example, Zhu Guangkuan. As for light, it was still a mystery. They could unleash their swords endlessly. As long as they had a trace of mana, they would never stop. But external swords could not do that. How many flying swords could an external sword's sword box keep? 4 foundation establishment, 7 or 8 flying swords were the limit. Even Jin Dan cultivators like them could only refine a dozen flying swords. They would be at a great disadvantage in a battle. Sword spirits were rare. It was already a great fortune for a flying sword to produce a sword spirit. How could one expect the same luck to befall them twice? Unless there was a special method or a special constitution and spirit. Therefore, when the internal sword truly activated the kiting sword, a flying sword with a sword spirit would appear very weak. It would not be able to produce that kind of storm-like feeling. And once the internal sword grasped the initiative, the power of a heavy sword would not be able to be unleashed. Of course, this would depend on the choice of battle tactics. If Lu Xiaoyi could unleash his strength and seize the opportunity to attack from a distance, then he would win. Once he was entangled, even if it was a flying sword with a sword spirit, it would be very difficult to completely block the inner sword's storm-like attacks. Lu Xiaoyi had only been in the sect for 40 years. How many flying swords could he refine? Under normal circumstances, he could refine 2 or 3 flying swords. Reproducing a sword spirit would probably take even longer. This was the reason why the Jin Dan cultivators were worried. At this point, the battle had truly entered the exciting stage. They were starting to use all kinds of methods. There were 16 people left, 14 internal swords and 2 external swords. Lu Xiaoyi and his second senior brother. Everyone knew that his second senior brother would not be able to survive the next round. Everyone's eyes were on him. If he lost again, it was estimated that more than half of the spectators would leave. Everyone was an external sword cultivator. Was it interesting to watch the internal sword cultivators fight? There was still not much time to rest. The enlightened masters were too lazy to waste their lives on such an occasion. The first match was his second senior brother. This was a hurdle that he could not avoid. He wanted to step over it, but he lacked the strength to support it. His current opponent was the internal sword cultivator ranked in the top 100 of the 5 Rings ranking list. Whether in name or in reality, he was better than him. Liu Xiaoyi had always suspected that the external sword cultivator had thrown the match in the drawing of lots so that his disciples would not meet a stronger opponent. But now it was difficult to use this method. It was too conspicuous. The two of them did not use the method of collision to determine the winner. It was not that the internal sword cultivator was weak, but that his second senior brother was weak. He knew that he had no chance in a collision, so he changed his moves in an attempt to find a loophole in his opponent's moves. The result was very normal. He did not find a loophole in the internal sword cultivator's moves. Instead, the internal sword cultivator found a loophole in his moves. There was no suspense. Chapter 389. Liu Xiaoyi was now the only child, a lonely branch. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of eyes, he finally realized the responsibility on his shoulders. There were some things that didn't need to be said. When things developed to a certain point, you would naturally take the initiative to shoulder the burden. This was the intention of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion's golden cores, to make it so that you had nowhere to run. Fall into the trap. This was the value of the eldest senior brother. Yin Dao was one of the earliest members of the Yin generation. He had entered the sect nearly 50 years earlier than Liu Xiaoyi. He was considered young among the cultivators on the inner sword ranking, but his strength was not simple. He was ranked 29th in the 5-Ring Foundation building ranking, belonging to the second tier. Just from the ranking alone, he was in existence on the same level as Liu Xiaoyi. This was also the level that cultivators were most unconvinced of. Everyone had a competitive heart, let alone cultivators. It was just that the higher the realm, the deeper the concealment. He felt that he had an obligation to uphold the tradition of the inner sword. He couldn't push everything to his senior brother Guangming. He hoped that he could be the Terminator. He didn't think that this was a difficult task. This so-called eldest senior brother of the external sword was indeed powerful, but he had good eyesight and could vaguely see the truth of the matter. For example, the power of the second sword after the first was not as strong. His eyesight was indeed very sharp. Although the unbalanced fulcrum was Liu Xiaoyi's original creation, in this cultivation world, nothing could be hidden from others. As long as you used it, people would be able to guess the truth from the subtle differences in your method of retrieving the flying sword. In other words, as long as he withstood the first sword, the rest of the rhythm would be controlled by him. For someone like him who had been fighting for a long time, dodging the opponent's big move was a necessary skill. He had many methods. This was the bloody experience of fighting against a magic cultivator. It wasn't something that could be taught. This was the reason why he was ranked 29th. He had battle experience against the top 10 cultivators. In terms of rich experience, those inner sword cultivators who were ranked higher than him might not be able to compare to him. Entering the space, first sliding 10 li, then leaning to the side, entering the sword stance. What he practiced was the use ancient escape technique, combined with the fire and water escape technique of the 5 elements. He was known for his elusive escape technique. No matter how heavy his opponent's sword was, it couldn't lock him down. His opponent was still unhurried. The starlight in his hand did not have a trace of smoke or fire. Removing the sword case on his back, no one would doubt that he was a spell cultivator. The star department was a very secluded path. There were also senior and junior brothers in the inner sword department, but none of them were as carefree as the outer sword eldest senior brother in front of him. Just from this point alone, it was not without reason that this person was valued by the rankings. For 1,000 feet away, the outer sword shot out as expected. It was as wild as ever, and it directly attacked. The Flu Dao's reaction was completely different from the previous cultivators. He He didn't stop, nor did he hesitate. Instead, he met the sword head-on, but he didn't release a single sword. To meet the sword, one needed courage and a precise grasp of distance. If one flew too fast, the sword would collide. If one flew too slow, the effect would be less than ideal. Flu Dao was very familiar with this technique. It was his specialty in the arena. First, he wandered, making the opponent think that he was waiting for an opportunity to fight. Then, he rushed, going back to his old path and catching the opponent off guard. Colliding had always been the strong point of the inner sword. He didn't believe that a young outer sword eldest senior brother could beat him in this aspect. His opponent was obviously suspicious, and he was even more careful while taking his time. Others might not be able to detect this, but as his opponent, he could keenly sense even the slightest bit of hesitation from his opponent. Now, his opponent's speed had slowed down in an extremely inconspicuous manner, and this was the effect he wanted to achieve. The flying sword was like lightning, and his figure was like flying. At a delicate point, the Flu Dao launched the shadow attaching sword. This was a high-end application of the inner sword's most practical teleportation technique. As soon as he disappeared, the 4 seasons had passed through a shadow. The timing was just right. Below, there were exclamations, which then turned into sighs. To master this technique, one had to endure countless stabs. A simple shadow attaching sword was enough to get rid of the outer sword's incomparably powerful first heavy sword. At this moment, the 4 seasons were already behind him. If he wanted to turn around, it would be his second attack with insufficient power. This was Lu Xiaoyi's self-created unbalanced 28 fulcrum point 2. Although the Flu Dao was very clear that after the next weak attack, there would definitely be another heavy attack, it didn't matter. He was fighting for this moment. When his flying sword exploded, he believed that this outer sword wouldn't be able to do anything. After charging forward for a few hundred feet, he revealed his figure. This was because he didn't want to engage in close combat. Close combat was the last resort, and it might not be effective. It was very threatening to Dharma cultivators who were bad at close combat, but to Xinyuan people who were also swordsmen, it was very rare to hear of anyone who was afraid of close combat. His goal was to enter within a distance of 200 feet. At that time, it would be the stage for his flying sword. He really wanted to see how many flying swords with sword spirits this outer sword eldest senior brother could pull out from his sword case. Just as he revealed his figure, his battle instincts had already caused him to explode with a powerful attack. Dozens of flying swords shot out rapidly. After the flying sword shot out, he recovered from his momentary daze and used his divine sense to search for the opponent's position. This was also the ability of a true expert's inner sword. Others needed to lock onto the target with their divine sense before releasing the sword, but he could do so after releasing the sword and then lock onto the target. This was the kind of situation where he could release the sword at the first moment. The essence of a battle was to seize the moment. He did it. However, he didn't do it either. The shadow sword possession was perfect, the distance control was perfect, and the first flying sword was also perfect, but in the end, he was stuck because in the direction his divine sense scanned, there was no trace of the opponent. No matter how perfect the explosion of the flying sword was, it still needed to find the target. If there was no one in front, then there must be someone behind. He didn't panic in the face of danger and continued to fly forward. If the opponent was behind him, the attack would have already begun. He used his divine sense to scan behind him. As expected, the outer sword had unknowingly turned behind him. There was no doubt that when he activated the shadow sword possession, the outer sword must have activated his secret teleportation technique at the same time. He could teleport in front of the flying sword, but the opponent could teleport at the same time as he teleported. The opponent's ability to grasp the timing was above his. What kind of monster was this? However, he didn't have time to think about this, because the outer sword's first flying sword had turned back and was already within 1,000 feet of him. This flying sword indeed had a sword spirit. It was abnormally agile. Although the distance was very close, he knew that the second attack of this flying sword would be very weak. This was his judgment from the previous 2 battles. Although he didn't understand the principle, he believed in his intuition. There was no room for him to dodge. When the flying sword was within 1,000 feet of the cultivator and controlled by the sword spirit, he couldn't escape. Of course, there was no need for him to dodge. Against a weak sword, he could just scatter it with his sword. Even in such a dangerous situation, he didn't forget to attack his opponent. Several flying swords attacked his opponent. This was a swordsman's principle: never passively defend. His explosive power was still there. In an instant, several flying swords had already collided. His control was different from Guangquan's. He didn't make any mistakes. The flying swords he sent out all hit the materialized sword without exception. Then, Yin Dao's heart sank. This sword wasn't a weak sword at all. It was as strong as before and heavy as ever. Did I guess wrong? Yin Dao smiled bitterly. That flying sword had pushed through all the obstructions and stopped directly on his forehead. This wasn't the opponent showing mercy. This was a real person making a move. He had lost, and he had lost decisively. In theory, it was still a single sword. This person was a monster. Chapter 390. Author's note: Old Man Wenwu is pressing me, and Sloth is also on his last breath. With all these reasons, it's normal to have one more update today and 3 more tomorrow. I really can't take it anymore. Lu Xiaoyi exited the space and pursed his lips. Playing mind games with him? His original 8-8 imbalance pivot could be 8 first and then 2, or 2 first and then 8. Why must the first strike be a heavy sword? It could be a feint first and then a real one. After this battle, the situation was clear. The tens of thousands of cultivators present understood that the final battle would be between the 5th-ranked light and the 11th-ranked cigarette, but his opponent, the 29th-ranked cigarette, but was also dealt within 1 strike. Ordinary inner swords could no longer stop this emerging outer sword hero. Not only was his sword heavy, but what was even more frightening was his grasp of the battle situation. His control of timing. His performance was top-notch, but he still had not discovered a weakness. Moreover, even if he did reveal a weakness, would anyone believe him? Was it a trap? Was it a trap? The outer swords on the snowy plains were excited. The outer sword were about to make a comeback. They were lucky enough to witness this miracle. The Jean Dan of the outer swords could not hold back their joy. A real hero had jumped out from the cracks of a rock. He was destined to leave a deep mark in the history of Xianyuan. Light took a deep breath and smiled. I'm luckier than senior brother Light, Glory. I'm lucky enough to witness the rise of the outer swords. But he doesn't have the chance. This battle between the inner and outer swords is starting to get interesting. There were only 8 left. One outer sword was unusually eye-catching and became the target of public criticism. This was an unavoidable outcome, and he was already prepared for it. His power had already gathered to a certain extent. He did not know when he would be able to break through if this continued, so he could only take it 1 step at a time. When Smokey arrived, there was only 1 battle left. She had just returned from the western regions and rushed here as soon as she heard the news. Fortunately, she did not miss it. She did not care about the curious gazes of the other cultivators and went directly to Lu Xiaoyi's side. Little E, this light came from Qin Kong. I know a little about his situation. Lu Xiaoyi stopped her. Senior sister, don't say anything. Just let me handle it myself. Smokey looked at him and sighed in her heart. She was too concerned and had oversimplified the situation. For a capable swordsman, the strength of their opponent was not that important. The key to a battle was how to unleash one's abilities, not how to constantly think about the opponent. If his opponent had a powerful divine ability and he was constantly on guard, would he still be able to strike his own rhythm? Understanding one's opponent was a double-edged sword. Some people liked it and some didn't. Relatively speaking, the stronger one was, the higher one's realm was, and the more confident one was, the more disdainful one would be of the so-called opponent's secrets. There were tens of thousands of cultivators in this world. Who knew who your next opponent would be? Could he understand it? He didn't lose his confidence. The way Smokey saw it, this junior brother of his was becoming more and more confident. He was no longer that timid junior brother who led the way in front of the Wolf Ridge and thought of how to scheme against others when he fought. Right now, he was already Xuanyuan's eldest senior martial brother with over 20,000 Foundation establishment swords, not just in name, but in reality. It was even possible for him to become Xuanyuan's eldest senior martial brother with both internal and external sword veins. Seeing the young cultivator she was familiar with grow into a towering tree, she couldn't help but feel somewhat jealous. She could no longer provide him with protection. That little swordsman who had foolishly agreed to everything in the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion was now even disdaining to hear the secret of being the #1 Foundation establishment cultivator in the internal sword. The affairs of the world were hard to predict. The blue sea turned into mulberry fields, but in reality, only a few short decades had passed. Someone came to her side and snorted, "This brat is going to overturn the heavens. I risked my life to save him in Halua City. Now he's turning his back on me and wants to trample the entire internal sword under his feet. He doesn't care about our old friendship at all." Hearing this sour tone, it could only be Smoky Wave. "But he's my junior martial brother, and always will be. Don't even think about making me call him senior martial brother." Smoky Wave insisted. Smoky Wave sneered, "If you don't believe me, just wait and see. Not only will you have to call him senior martial brother in the future, you might even have to call him martial uncle in the future." After a pause, she still couldn't hold back her surging gossipy heart. "I just don't know if you want to call him husband?" Seeing Smoky Wave's sharp brows looking at him, he didn't know why. But even though his strength was clearly far above hers, he still felt a bit scared. This was the feeling between true friends, right? However, his mouth was still stubborn. "Junior martial sister, I'm doing this for your own good. Did you know that I obtained information from the most secret of channels?" This brat used his official position for personal gain during a mission in Arai. He secretly had an affair with a female cultivator from the Kuan Dao separation realm on Fangting Island. She's called Hanyan. If you don't have this intention, then just treat it as if I'm farting. If you do have this intention, then you have to hurry up. The one who strikes first gains the advantage, and the one who strikes later suffers. Your location is closer, and the conditions are much more convenient. If you really can't do it, then I'll help you. If you get him drunk one day, junior martial sister, you can force yourself on him. The snowy plains below the hidden sword peak were packed with people. Some of them had jobs, some were in seclusion, and some were uninterested. They all rushed here one after another. In their hearts, they were very clear that such a grand occasion only happened once in 10,000 years. Perhaps it wouldn't happen again in 10,000 years. If they missed it, they would never see it again. This was no joke. Even Light felt a trace of indescribable pressure. This was a pressure that he didn't feel when he was on the 5-ring ranking list. The glory of the inner sword would be shouldered by him alone. In the past, there was senior martial brother Light brilliance, so he didn't need to think too much about it. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. Would it be that he wouldn't need to think too much about it in the future? Would Xuanyuan's Foundation establishment directly change from the era of light brilliance to the era of cigarette butts? He couldn't think like that, or he would lose his sword heart. Ling Ruofeng's group gathered together, nervously looking at the battle space above them. They hoped that one day they would also stand here and receive the cheers of the crowd. Even if they weren't as glorious as Little E, it would still be good to show their faces. Who didn't have a desire to improve themselves? The affairs of the world were impermanent. Thinking back to the time when they were plundered, Little E was the most unwilling one. The reason why he had followed them was purely an accident. But now that he thought about it, this was the magic of fate, right? What he didn't want the most, he would get it. And what he wanted, he would get nothing. His opponent, Chao Wendao, had been killed by Little Yi's scheme, becoming a springboard for fate. How pitiful! At that time, Little E had displayed an extraordinary talent for killing people. Unfortunately, none of them had noticed. That's not right. Someone had noticed. Qin Erong had noticed. But what was the use? Her attention couldn't even keep up with the rise of this new star. After entering and exiting the dome a few times, in a short 40 years, He was going to become Xuanyuan's senior martial brother. She had revised her plan countless times, but she had to change it again and again because her imagination wasn't enough. She wasn't bold enough. Could she be blamed for this? Who would have thought that a little cultivator from a remote astral world would be able to shine in such a big scene like the Five Rings? Where was his limit? Qi Nerong already didn't dare to think about it. Chapter 391. As usual, Lu Xiaoyi advanced at a moderate speed. He was not afraid of the slightest thing, nor was he in a hurry to succeed. He could vaguely feel a kind of power, a power that looked down on his opponent. And because of the existence of this power, he did not hesitate to reject his senior sister's help. If it was before, he would definitely listen. Knowing oneself and knowing one's opponent was the guarantee of victory. But he also knew that if he listened, the power that he had painstakingly cultivated would be gone. Either he chose the power, or he chose to know his opponent's secret. He chose the former, because after comprehending the power of power, this thing would follow him for life. And if he only understood Light's background, it would only solve the problem of this battle. In the last few battles, almost everyone had their own power, and they all had their own trump cards. He won very quickly, but the dangers and difficulties were clear in his heart. His trump card were revealed one by one. In the fourth battle, the Bai Shun sword spirit attached to the Four Seasons, and the dual sword spirits attached to the Bai Shun's mental attack. In the fifth battle, the appearance of the hidden fragrance flying sword shocked the Jin Dan swordsman. The birth of one sword spirit could be explained by luck, but if there were two sword spirits, even an idiot would know that there was some kind of trick involved. Since the start of the battle, external sword spiritual master had been indifferent. But when Lu Xiaoyi revealed the second flying sword with a sword spirit, his expression changed slightly. If this was an experience that could be spread, then Xuanyuan's external sword sect would change the decline of tens of thousands of years. It might not be able to suppress the internal sword sect, but at least they would be on equal footing. This point could be seen from Cigarette Butt's performance this time. Lu Xiaoyi's stunning performance this time was because his two flying swords with sword spirits had alarmed the higher-ups. This was also the main reason why everyone felt that he was strong. Because of this, they had neglected some of the most important qualities of a swordsman, such as decisiveness, insight, and the instinctive sense and grasp of battle opportunities. These things might not be deeply perceived by outsiders, but to the internal swordsman who had participated in the battle, it was unforgettable. This external sword senior brother indeed had a lot of trump cards, but what was even more frightening was his grasp of timing, when to use them. This person had the ability to directly turn his trump cards into victory. This ability sounded simple, but was very difficult to execute. To most people, this was an ability that could not be learned, because it was not a simple matter of using a trump card, but when to use it. What was the atmosphere of battle? It was not only a problem of the trump card, but also a problem of the battle mentality of the battle. The most important thing now was, had this eldest senior brother used up all his trump cards? No one would think so. In that case, based on the way he used his trump card, wouldn't the next time he used his trump card signify the end of the battle? This was the application of the force in battle. Through the course of a series of battles, he would imperceptibly influence the opponent's psychology, causing the opponent to be cautious in their suspicions, paranoid in their cautiousness, and timid in their suspicions. Lu Xiaoyi had already understood the true meaning of the force of force. To achieve this, he still needed to fight continuously, and he still needed to pretend to be disdainful of his opponent. One day, he would be able to achieve this by relying on his reputation, environment, speech, and even a certain flashy appearance. That would be the true mastery of the force of force. When Guangming appeared in the arena, the first thing he did was to use a very special force, silent force. Silent force took the meaning of silent heaven and earth, accumulating pressure, and attacking only after the opponent attacked. The stronger the opponent's attack, the stronger the force of force he could condense. This was in consideration of Lu Xiaoyi's invincible and fiery attacks from the very beginning. So far, no one had been able to withstand his first three axes, so they chose to be on the defensive. Being able to make the inner sword take a defensive stance was a victory in terms of mentality. However, Lu Xiaoyi did not know that Light's silent defense was not as simple as not using the sword. Instead, it would still attack and accumulate silent energy during the attack. This was a very brilliant way of attack and defense. Compared to the silent force of Light, the force of might that he had comprehended for the first time was not enough. Instead, it would accelerate the accumulation of his opponent's silent force. There was no difference between silent force and force of might, but there was a difference in the comprehension of cultivators. From this point of view, Lu Xiaoyi's force of might that he had accumulated in the past 5 rounds had been seen through. His opponent's tit-for-tat response had put him in an awkward position instead. Withdrawing the power of intimidation could not really affect the opponent's silence, but it could delay the accumulation of the opponent's silence. If he did not withdraw it, he would be suspected of being too close to the opponent and would instead accelerate the accumulation of the opponent's silence. As soon as both sides entered the fighting space, before they even saw each other, Lu Xiaoyi had already suffered a loss in terms of force of might. It was not that he had made a wrong choice, but his weakness in understanding the force of might was accurately grasped by his opponent. If he had mastered the force of might to the point of perfection, he would not have been suppressed. It was just a matter of whether he could win with his force of might first, or whether the opponent's silence would succeed in counterattacking. Because he was not familiar with the application of force, Light had taken the initiative before they came into contact. In a battle with Light, Lu Xiaoyi could no longer hide his sword skills, nor could he plan to end the battle quickly. The so-called battle was to display one's strengths to the extreme. His first strength was the length of his sword. Unlike before, when he was 4,000 feet away from his opponent, he began to attack from 5,000 feet away. The 4 seasons came like a shadow. For the swordsmen who were watching the battle below, such a distance was useless. But in their eyes, their eldest senior brother's control of the flying sword from 5,000 feet away was still very skillful. Just this alone was enough to beat most of the cultivators in the same realm. Since he had given up on the long distance, of course, he could not close the distance. Lu Xiaoyi began to control the distance between them to maintain between 4,500 feet to 5,500 feet so that he could only hit the opponent without being hit. This was the classic tactic of a long-distance swordsman. It was widely used. You cannot say that this tactic was mediocre just because it was common. This was the most correct choice. Guangming was also very depressed. He was not afraid of the opponent's strange tactics, because his tactics were also very varied. He had been through hundreds of battles, but he did not have any special way to counter this kind of simple, most common, and most unskilled long-range attack. But before he came up with a solution, he had to personally feel the power of the opponent's heavy sword. This was the cornerstone of the tactic. Otherwise, he could not be sure how much effort he had to put in to defend. He was very clear that the frequency of the sword explosion of his fellow disciples was below 15 sword strikes in a breath, but he could easily reach 20 sword strikes in a breath. Not only that, he also had the force of bloody battle to rely on. The closer the opponent's attack was, the heavier his sword chi would be. He did not believe that he could not block the opponent's single flying sword with his blocking power. If that was the case, there was no need to fight. Chapter 392. Guangming's flying swords had a range of 4,000 feet. This was already a terrifying distance, but he only started to attack when he was 3,000 feet away. He needed to leave a distance of 1,000 feet to confuse his opponent's judgment. The gushing swords formed a line and accurately struck the advancing 4 seasons without missing a single one. This was the embodiment of perfect control of the soul. As the distance got closer, the chain of flying swords became denser and denser. The power of the swords became stronger and stronger. Finally, the invincible 4 seasons stopped advancing. This was the first time they showed signs of exhaustion. Among the spectators, the outer swords watched nervously. They clearly knew what this meant. Many of the inner swords heaved a sigh of relief. They had blocked the attack. The following battle would enter Guangming's rhythm. This was because the sharpest part of the outer swords was this invincible heavy sword. Once it was blocked, the inner swords would have an absolute advantage in terms of sword frequency. Even if there was a flying sword with spirit, it was a sword used for sneak attacks and not a sword used for battle. The difference between the two was huge. In Guangming's own probing, he had blocked his opponent's heavy sword a total of 14 times. These are not the ordinary 14 times, but the bloody battle flying sword that was stronger as it went on. In all the battles he had fought in his life, this was the first time he had encountered an attack that required him to block 14 times. It was not an injustice for his juniors to lose. If he had not comprehended the bloody battle momentum, it would have been difficult for him to block Guangming's attack, even if he used all his flying swords. However, this was not the way to compare strength. Guangming's sword momentum also had the goat horn momentum. At their level, sword momentum was normal. If you did not comprehend the momentum, you would not be able to enter this circle. He had to try again to determine the pattern of the strength of his opponent's flying swords. This way, he would be more confident in formulating a counterattack strategy. It was said that the Xianyuan swordsman would attack hot-bloodedly. This was wrong. The ferocious attack was only a facade. There was an intricate calculation behind it. In this aspect, he was no different from a spell cultivator. It was just that swordsman's probing was more direct and suffocating. Lu Xiaoyi did not make any changes. Since the opponent did not approach him, he would continue to attack from afar. Light was testing his attack power, and he was also testing Light's defense power. This was a mutual process, and there was no need to talk about who had the upper hand. He could acutely feel the uniqueness of the radiant flying sword. The frequency of the sword far exceeded that of the other inner swords. There were more than 20 swords in every breath. The closer it was to the opponent, the stronger the momentum. He was also considering whether he could break through his opponent's defense if he changed his flying sword to his most powerful attack, Ju City, and if he used the Stellar Sword Force. The answer was yes. However, the prerequisite was that the opponent had no other trump cards. All of this had happened in less than 10 breaths of time, from entering the battle space to approaching and probing. After that, the battle sped up. Since they were all swordsmen, they had no interest in wasting time like spellcasters. Once the probing was over, the outcome would be revealed immediately. Light used Shadow Sword 3 times in a row, and he was already within 3,000 feet of Lu Xiaoyi. Following that, his flying swords flew out like a storm, almost reaching the peak of a cultivator's sword-light division. The timing he chose was very tricky. It was right after Lu Xiaoyi's 4 seasons was 8 times stronger. He had already understood the strength and weakness of this external sword senior brother's flying swords. After 8 times stronger, it would be 2 times weaker. This would buy him a precious moment of time. As long as his flying swords could entangle his opponent, he was confident that he could make his opponent lose the initiative to attack forever. Shadow Sword was a must-have technique for almost every inner swordsman. It was simple and practical, and could be used to break through, close in, or escape. It was fast and impossible to guard against. Different cultivators had different innate abilities, and their achievements in Shadow Sword were different. For example, Light could use Shadow Sword 3 times in a row in an instant. But for Smoke Duct, it could not be used continuously. There must be a pause in the middle, and the duration was different. This was a reason why Smoke Duct had to face the 4 seasons after he used Shadow Sword once. Of course, Smoke Duct guessed wrong at that time. He thought that the attack was 2 times weaker, but he did not expect it to be 8 times stronger. But this time, Light was very sure that even if the 4 seasons followed him, according to the rule, it must be 2 times weaker. The instant movement of external swords could not be used continuously. For example, Lu Xiaoyi's Sky Measuring Sword Ruler was the prerequisite for the flying sword to fly out and then measure. In other words, the direction had been fixed, and the flying sword had lost its suddenness and concealment. The key was that he needed the flying sword to jump out again before he could launch the Sky Measuring Sword Ruler for the second time. It was because of the congenital difference in Kung Fu that he could not use the same instant movement to resist Light's 3 consecutive movements. A simple approach was calculated to the extreme by Light. The two of them were originally 5,000 feet apart. Now that he had moved forward to 3,000 feet, he had calculated that even if Lu Xiaoyi moved at the maximum distance, he would not be able to get 2,000 to 3,000 feet away from his back. It was still within the range of his flying sword's control, unless Lu Xiaoyi chose to get close, but he did not know where Light's final destination was, so it was difficult for him to get close to him. Lu Xiaoyi's speed could not offset such a close distance by relying on the guidance of the starlight alone. This was the qualitative difference between the escape method and teleportation. There was no better way, so he could only block it head-on. Like the Light, he had to rely on his own flying sword to block the opponent's flying sword. Hidden Fragrance, Big Dipper, and Huayu. Except for the still hidden Ju City, all of Lu Xiaoyi's flying swords came out together. With Hidden Fragrance as the main and Big Dipper as the supplement, they intercepted the incoming flying swords. Those flying swords looked like flying swords, but in fact they were more like sword chi. As soon as he used this defensive method, Light immediately understood the number of flying swords. There were 2 main swords with sword spirits, and 2 supplementary swords that did not even have a complete sword formation. This was in line with the progress of his 40 years of swordsmanship. 4 flying swords, 2 living swords, 2 nurturing swords. But he still could not ignore the possibility of a 3rd flying sword with sword spirit. Lu Xiaoyi had a hard time blocking. Hidden Fragrance was a flying sword that was flexible, but its power was much weaker than the 4 Seasons, not to mention the Ju City that focused on strength. The other Big Dipper and Huayu could only be said to have little effect. They were unformed flying swords with only 5 layers. Often, after blocking 1 or 2 attacks, they would be on the verge of collapse and need to be recharged. He had no choice but to rely on his escape method to dodge, so he was obviously in a difficult situation. This sudden change made the spectating swordsman's hearts skip a beat. This was the closest Xuanyuan's outer swords had come to a turnaround in tens of thousands of years. It was hard to imagine that there would not be a second time. There were many inner swords experts, and now was the best time. The most powerful, brilliant Light had been upgraded to Jindan. For the time being, there was only Light supporting the outer swords. In another 50 years, the outer swords would definitely not have another cigarette, but it would be normal for the inner swords to have a few brilliant lights. Although they also knew that eldest senior brother had already reached this step, but people were always greedy. Since he had already reached this step, why not take another step forward? But the battle situation did not change according to their will. The inner swords of Light had already begun to gain the upper hand. For the inner swords, once they grasped the initiative, it would be extremely difficult to turn the tables. Eldest senior brother, after all, was still the eldest senior brother of the first 3 axes. Chapter 393. Light did indeed have the upper hand, but he felt that this kind of advantage made him feel uncomfortable. It was not as satisfying as it was in previous battles. The problem was with the 4-season sword. Because it was constantly changing between light and heavy attacks, Light's defense was also changing between light and heavy. When the 4-season sword attacked lightly, he could focus on attacking Lu Xiaoyi. When the 4-seasons sword attacked heavily, he had no choice but to spend a lot of energy on defense, so the strength of his attacks on his opponent would be reduced. In this kind of situation, he could only watch helplessly as he lost many opportunities. He could not increase his strength to take down his opponent in one fell swoop. He was very clear about the power of the flying sword entangling him. It required a lot of effort, so he had to deal with it carefully. What disgusted him the most was that the flying sword not only changed in strength, but also in spirit. At his position, there was no one in the same realm who could match his spirit power, at least in the inner sword. However, the flying sword spirit attack had never stopped. It was not enough to put him in a difficult situation, but it could more or less affect his performance. He was very suspicious. This was a sword spirit that knew how to attack with spirit power, But how could such a sword spirit be so powerful in both speed and strength? He could not figure it out no matter how he thought about it. Of course, he did not expect that there were two sword spirits in the Four-Seasons sword. One was the sword spirit, and the other was the parasite spirit. In the battle, they each did their own work. The Four Seasons were responsible for pure attacks, and the parasite spirit was responsible for spirit harassment. After 10 years of cooperation, the two sword spirits could be considered to have each performed their own duties, complementing each other. With the Four-Seasons sword, it was very difficult for him to use his full attack power, even if the outer sword was always on the verge of collapse. The battlefield was divided into two centers. With light as the center, a string of flying swords surrounded Four Seasons and attacked. On Lu Xiaoyi's center, Hidden Fragrance led 7-star and Huayu to meet force with the flying swords. The two centers were closely linked, and any change in one would trigger a chain reaction in the other. Sword light crisscrossed, and light and shadow crisscrossed. Without the support of powerful spiritual power, it was impossible to maintain this situation. In this regard, at least Lu Xiaoyi was not inferior to Light, who had dominated for decades. To be strong, there must be a reason behind it. In the eyes of the other cultivators, this external sword eldest senior brother was basically sitting firmly in his position as the two bearers. The others did not have the ability to compete with Light on both offense and defense. Techniques had already lost their meaning in this world. The so-called drawing of a sword flower, grasping the sword's momentum, using feints, and so on, the mortal world's martial arts techniques did not exist in the world of cultivation. Every strike was aimed at a vital point, and every sword strike was done with all its might. The rhythm was getting faster and faster, and this was Light gradually exerting its power. He didn't want to get close, although close combat was his strength. Who knew if it was his opponent's strength as well? In the end, the dignified inner sword was forced to use the sword in hand to determine victory. This was a blasphemy to the sword pill. The battle between the inner and outer swords should be a sword pellet against a flying sword and nothing else. What he wanted to do was to explode with the maximum sword light in a fair and square manner, and defeat his opponent in a direct confrontation. Light knew that in terms of exploding sword frequencies, he was inferior to his senior brother Light Illumination. Although his highest sword frequency was about the same as Light Illumination's explosiveness was abrupt and had a large range. He could suddenly increase from 10 sword strikes in a breath to the limit of 30 sword strikes in a breath. Then he would slow down, explode, and change the rhythm back and forth a few times. No matter how strong the opponent was, they would bow down to this sudden change in rhythm. But he couldn't do it. This kind of abnormal explosiveness would cause his sea of consciousness to explode. He could only slowly increase the number of sword strikes step by step. In the end, he could explode to the limit of 27 sword strikes in a breath and 8 sword strikes in a breath. But when it really reached this state, which ordinary person could withstand it? The sword whistled fiercely in the sky, and the sound of the air splitting was ear-piercing. Because the frequency of the sword strikes was too high, the flying swords almost formed a line and became a sword whip. This kind of strange scene was what almost every inner sword cultivator dreamed of. And only at this kind of time, with such an opponent, could they feast their eyes. Was this the final struggle? Seeing eldest Shixiang struggling under the sword whip, the outer swords watching the battle felt their hearts turn cold. Many of them had fought with the inner swords before, no matter if it was on the sword branch platform or in private. In most cases, they had lost to such a rain of swords. This wasn't their fault. This was the fault of the flying swords. The corporeal sword could never compare to the illusory sword in terms of explosiveness. This was Tao and cannot be changed. Even if their eldest senior brother had increased the power of the corporeal sword to an unimaginable level, when it couldn't kill in one strike, it would still fall into the awkward situation of comparing sword frequency and quantity. It would become more and more unbearable. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't hold on any longer. The Four Seasons had already done their best. For the time being, he couldn't increase the disturbance of the Four Seasons to light. This was already their limit. They had helped him share a great deal of the pressure. A hole had appeared in his defensive flying swords. Hidden Fragrance, who was not the main flying sword, was carrying two crooked swords. It was becoming more and more difficult for him to defend. Sword light constantly leaked out of his defense, causing him to be in a mess. He couldn't continue like this. If he continued to persist, if he wasn't careful, he would hand over the victory. When he used his trump card, it had always been used with a purpose. Every time he used it, it would be a miracle. However, the opponent this time was too strong. They were directly suppressing him, making it impossible for his crooked methods to be used. Now, he had no choice but to use his trump card to save the situation. There was no other way. The sword box shook and Ju City flew out. The Big Dipper rain entered the box, and the situation immediately changed. Ju City was also his main flying sword. The time it took to refine, it wasn't much shorter than the Four Seasons. It was even more powerful than the other swords. Once it came out, the passive situation immediately stabilized. It cooperated with Hidden Fragrance and firmly blocked the flying swords outside. Under the attacks of the sword whips, it didn't move. When Ju City came out, the reactions of the spectators were all different. In the eyes of the external sword Taoist master in Jindan, this was definitely not a coincidence. There was a method to cultivate a sword spirit, and the truth behind it made people yearn for it. In the large crowd of spectators, the external swords let out heaven-shaking cheers. Eldest senior brother was still hiding something. He really was able to keep his composure. Who knew if he still had something else? It was hard to say. However, among the participating swordsmen, the majority of them had already determined the direction of victory and defeat. Cigarette, but was in danger. They had been through life and death situations for a long time and had their own unique vision. When a cultivator passively took out his trump card to strengthen his defense, it already indicated his limit. What was Senior Brother Light's trump card? No idea. How much more explosive could the sword frequency be? No idea. The external sword eldest senior brother had no choice but to reveal his third flying sword. No one would think that he had a fourth. If that was the case, he could throw out 8 or 10 flying swords at once. Not to mention Senior Brother Light. Even Senior Brother Light Glory wouldn't be able to withstand it. His potential had been exhausted. Defeat was only a matter of time. Chapter 394. Lu Xiaoyi's Zhu Cheng immediately stabilized the situation, but Guang Ming's sword frequency was still rising. More than 20 swords in one breath. There was still no sign of stopping. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have a good way to deal with this for the time being. He couldn't escape. Although his escape technique was outstanding, and he had the power of the stars, he still couldn't escape perfectly with Guang Ming's 100 years of deep foundation. He was stuck. He couldn't pull away, nor could he close the distance. Escape technique was a direction that consumed a lot of time. 100 years of time difference wasn't that easy to close. Although his starlight guidance was very high level, Guang Ming's inner sword escape technique wasn't any worse than his. This kind of person who controlled the inner sword for a living would definitely choose the best path for his main skill. It was clear that Guang Ming wanted to use the flying swords to resolve the battle between the inner and outer swords. It was for the sake of being upright. Guang Ming was testing his limits. He was also waiting for Guang Ming's limits. He didn't believe that even if you were a crooked machine gun, could it be that you could turn into a Gatling gun? There was always a limit. Shooting like this, wasn't he afraid of emptying his body? In a few breaths, Guang Ming's sword frequency had already reached the level of 27 or 8 swords per breath. With this kind of intensity, when the Four Seasons were at 20% weak, the majority of the pressure came to Lu Xiaoyi's side. Zhu Cheng and Hidden Fragrance's side had to endure 23 or 4 swords. Lu Xiaoyi's defense began to show holes again. Fortunately, these holes didn't last forever. When the Four Seasons returned to 20% strong, the pressure would return to 20 swords. Intuitively, The two knew that it was time to see the results. Guangming couldn't maintain this kind of high frequency of attacks, while Lu Xiaoyi was limited by his cultivation. Controlling 3 flying swords at the same time was a heavy burden on his mana. For people at their level, the changes in their moves were meaningless. Instead, it would waste precious time. What they were truly fighting was power. But before they fought, the two used a supplementary skill at the same time. Guangming used the inner sword's secret technique, Drawn Sword Prison, while Lu Xiaoyi used the outer sword's secret technique, Fixed Star. Both of them had the same idea, which was to compare their inner and outer swords at the swordsman's most proficient mid-range. There was no conspiracy, no trickery, and it was a direct confrontation. Immediately after, at the most crucial moment of the battle, Light used another force that he had hidden for a long time, the goat horn force. It didn't sound like anything new, but there were only a handful of people in the inner sword group who could truly comprehend the goat horn force to a profound level. It was far from something Lu Xiaoyi's goat horn force could compare to. Light was the true big goat horn, while he was the little goat horn. He lacked time and the divine essence of countless sword strikes. In terms of offense and defense, he would use the goat horn stance to attack from 3,000 feet away, and use the bloody battle stance to defend within 100 feet. He would be able to accurately differentiate between the attacks, and not be confused in the crazy burst of close to 30 swords every second. Just based on this point alone, none of the inner sword elites could do it. Once the sword momentum was unleashed, the inner swordsmen gasped in amazement. They knew that the sword battle was about to end. Almost at the same time, Lu Xiaoyi no longer relied on his goat horn force. Instead, he added his most proficient, the star's force that he had comprehended the most. At Light's side, the 4 seasons, under the powerful support of the star's force, began to advance from 100 feet away to 150 feet away. They didn't stop and became fiercer and fiercer. They were getting closer and closer. But Light didn't care about the strong attacks of the 4 seasons. He continued to focus on his opponent's body because he believed in his bloody battle stance. The closer his opponent's flying swords were, the more powerful the bloody battle stance would be. At Lu Xiaoyi's side, the ferocious flying swords, under the support of Light's goat horn force to the point of perfection, were also closing in. Even if Lu Xiaoyi used his 2 swords to resist and the star's force, he couldn't completely withstand the pressure. His defensive circle had also shrunk to 150 feet. The key to victory or defeat seemed to be who was the first to stab the opponent. This change was beyond the expectations of the spectators. Even the Jin Dan couldn't accurately determine who would have the last laugh. Light had a chance. Cigarette, but also had a chance. Originally, they thought that victory was already decided, but now it had become a battle between both sides. They had to lick it. They couldn't even stop. At this moment, the external swords finally knew how strong their new senior was. At least now, he was on the same level as Light, who was ranked 4th in the Foundation establishment list. He wasn't inferior in the slightest. Even Light couldn't accurately determine whether his flying swords would break through first, or the opponent's 4 seasons would arrive first. He couldn't tolerate any accidents. He needed to win to his heart's content. He still had a trick up his sleeve, which was set up before the battle. Silent force. He had been suppressed for too long. Now he finally grasped the best opportunity. If he didn't die in silence, he would explode in silence. This was the true meaning of silent force. Once the power of silent force was unleashed, Lu Xiaoyi couldn't hold on any longer. The 4 seasons stopped advancing, while Zhu Cheng and Hidden Fragrance retreated. In a flash, Light's flying swords had already reached a range of 300 feet. Seeing that the outcome was about to be decided, the crowd of cultivators below let out a sigh. Lu Xiaoyi turned a deaf ear to them. He indeed didn't have any force, but that didn't mean he had no other way. In his short 40 years of cultivation, he hadn't been in contact with the category of force for a long time, only around 20 years. The first force he comprehended was the force of stars. Because of his natural affinity with stars, his progress in the force of stars was very fast. As for the force of sheep's horn, he had only comprehended it for 10 years and was far from mature. Needless to say, the force of might was the type that was sharpened at the last minute. Overall, Lu Xiaoyi's attainments in force were far inferior to Light's. This was a problem of accumulation over time. It wasn't something that could be solved with a flash of inspiration. The only thing he could barely contend with was the force of stars, but it wasn't as professional as Light's 3 forces. Attacking was attacking, defending was defending, and exploding was exploding. He was already at his wit's end in terms of force, but he had his own crooked method, force removal. This was a good thing that body cultivator Cui Shirtu had exchanged with him. He had never stopped studying it, but the more he studied it, the more profound it became. A lot of force removal required him to master this force and understand it before he could remove it. This really made people speechless. He finally understood why this cunning Shirtu would use this kind of secret technique to exchange for force removal. It was completely meaningless. There were countless forces in the cultivation world. Could it be that he had to understand every one of them before he could remove them? Who could do it? It's just a flower in the water. I'm just messing with you. But there were also secret techniques that could be used. For example, force removal. It meant that he could take the initiative to remove his force and conveniently remove his opponent's force as well. If his force was greater than or equal to his opponent in the battle, then he would have achieved the goal of force removal. Of course, his force would also be gone. But Lu Xiaoyi's battle prowess didn't completely rely on force. He really relied on the sword spirit. This was the reason why he was unique. Therefore, without any hesitation, he cleanly removed all 3 of his powers. Chapter 395. Lu Xiaoyi had removed his own force, and as a result, his star force, goat horn force, and majestic force were all wiped out. Moreover, Guang Ming's bloody battle force, goat horn force, and silent force were also wiped out. Erasing power had some kind of mysterious restriction. It couldn't be used again for a certain period of time. Therefore, the battle between the two became a battle of light. But there was one thing: the effects of power on both sides were different. No matter how much light urged his swords, the erased flying swords were unable to advance any further under the combined defense of Ju City and Hidden Fragrance. Lu Xiaoyi was finally able to defend the last 300 feet in front of him. On the other side, the 4 seasons began to rush forward. Lu Xiaoyi's erasing power seemed to have been delayed by Light's silence power by a breath. This kind of delay allowed the opponent's flying swords to break through the last 300 feet. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The reason why it was late was because he was waiting for the 4 seasons to switch from their weak state to their strong state. There were countless changes in between, but in reality, it had only been a few breaths of time since the 2 sides had locked onto each other. In the eyes of the bystanders, what they saw was the intertwining of light and shadow. But in reality, the changes in the momentum behind the scenes were the key to deciding the outcome of the battle. This was not something that everyone could see. The bystanders only felt the west wind tighten and the east wind become stronger. Even now, they couldn't be sure who would have a last laugh. When the sword's power was no longer there, the last several hundred feet were covered in the blink of an eye. Light had no choice but to focus all of his power on defending against the 4 seasons. Of course, he could defend against them. As long as he used all of his flying swords to stop the 4 seasons, the result would be Ju City and Hidden Fragrance closing in. At this point, the battle had returned from 2 focal points to 1. The intense attack and defense were about 200, 300 feet from Light's side. The sword light was still like a chain, blocking the 4 seasons, Ju City, Hidden Fragrance. They formed a final stalemate at 200 feet, waiting for the final change. 200 feet. Even someone as agile as the swordsman would find it difficult to escape the flying sword's pursuit at this distance. This was an attack and defense that no one could give up. It wasn't even a chance to change moves. Lu Xiaoyi had changed. All of their previous efforts had been wasted. As long as Light could catch his breath, it would be his doomsday. His problem was his FA. How long could he maintain this level of attack? The moment Light changed, he would be pierced by the flying swords that were close by. He didn't have the space to change his mind. His problem was overclocking. How long could he maintain nearly 30 swords in a breath? Humans were not machines. It was impossible for them to maintain such a high level of explosive power. But Light didn't retreat. Even if his brain matter exploded, he had to persevere until the last moment, because he was the last guardian of the glory of the Xianyuan Nijian lineage. If he fell, there would be no one. This was only in an instant. The host, Taoist Master Inner Sword, sighed and waved his hand. The two people who were stuck together were suddenly separated by an irresistible force, no matter how unwilling they were. The Sword of Swords, Soph the Hand sect, was of the Soph, his of the heart of hands of the of S of swords of the sect. Sich, a nascent soul Taoist master, judged that there were no technical problems in all of this. The battle space withdrew. Over 10,000 cultivators looked up at the Prime Minister, waiting for his judgment. Taoist Master Inner Sword's clear voice spread throughout the snowy plains. End. Outer Sword smoke, but wins. Inner Sword Guangming has lost. The entire snowfield froze for a moment. Then, a huge wave of cheers swept through the entire Hidden Sword Peak. Some of the old external sword cultivators had tears in their eyes. They had been pressed against the ground by the internal sword all their lives. They had never thought that there would be a day where they could hold their heads high like today. They couldn't change history, but they witnessed it. The Inner Sword participants looked desolate. Most of them had accepted it, but there were also those who were unconvinced. Yan Dao twisted his voice and said, "Grandmaster, I have doubts about the verdict. At the very least, this is a 2-point game. How can it be that my Inner Sword will lose?" The immortal host did not want to answer, but when he saw the expressions of the crowd, he knew that not answering might cause unnecessary dissatisfaction. Thus, he gave a rare explanation. Continue. The cigarette, but would damage his dantian and cripple his cultivation. The light would destroy the Niwen, and it would be no different from an idiot. Tell me, who won and who lost? This is Xuanyuan's competition. No matter who wins, it's Xuanyuan's victory. Don't let others say that our Inner Sword sect is arrogant and can't afford to lose. No one doubted it, because what the immortal said was the truth. Lu Xiaoyi could still cultivate, but there was no hope for him to reach the upper realm. However, if his brain exploded into paste, could he still be a cultivator? Immortal Outer Sword flew over and waved his hand. Senior brother is fair and selfless. I really admire you. He actually understood that even though the immortal host said that both sides were tied, he could not say anything. It was reasonable. Immortal Inner Sword smiled. Junior brother is wrong. This is not fair. This is a win-win. If Outer Sword wins, it can sweep away the decadence of Outer Sword for tens of thousands of years. If Inner Sword loses, it can wake up the arrogance of Inner Sword for tens of thousands of years. If the sword is not sharpened, people will not advance. To be honest, my Inner Sword sect has been waiting for this day for tens of thousands of years. How can I let go of such an opportunity? Just now, the immortals of One Guang Peak's Thunder Palace reminded me that they wanted me to help you win. I refused. Fortunately, you external swordsmen have obtained victory with your own strength, and you deserve it. Junior brother, congratulations. The Outer Sword has finally produced a talent. Immortal Outer Sword smiled knowingly. It is Xianyuan that produces talents in large numbers. The Inner Sword and Outer Sword are called Xianyuan in the outside world. This time, when Lu Xiaoyi returned to the Outer Sword sect's cultivators, they no longer nodded in greeting. Instead, they consciously called him eldest senior brother. There was no exception. 6 battles, 6 Inner Sword sect cultivators. From the hundreds of 5-ring foundation establishment cultivators, he had chosen all the way to 4th place. There was not the slightest bit of exaggeration. It was all based on the ability of the sword. To be honest with their abilities, it was a matter of one sword. There was no doubt. Henceforth, although only half of the 20 years had passed, his position as eldest senior brother was already set. At least among the Outer Sword sect, there was no one else who dared to challenge him. Life's fate was different from the past. Who would be able to reach his current position as a mere 999th place? From the looks of it, the person in charge of the rankings was truly unfathomable. Under the circumstances where he had not fought with anyone on the rankings, he had been pulled into the rankings. Furthermore, he had been pulled into the high position of 11th place. Who knew what they had discovered? Seeing his second senior brother and third senior brother surrounding him, he knew that he had to say something. A white face covers 100 ugliness. Fox odor destroys everything. My cultivation is really not good. It was almost emptied out by others. Therefore, I may have to go into seclusion for a period of time and work hard on my cultivation. Otherwise, I'm afraid the Inner Sword sect's troubles will not be resolved in a short period of time. Since I've turned over, I should at least have a good night's sleep. I can't be beaten back to my original state right after turning over. There are some matters that I'll have to trouble you senior brothers. I won't be participating for the time being. I'm ashamed of myself for being lazy. The Outer Sword sect's leaders nodded. Eldest senior brother was right. The Inner Sword sect's cultivators were definitely unwilling to accept this defeat. In the future, they would find other ways to challenge him. Eldest senior brother's abilities were top-notch in all other aspects, but his cultivation was a little awkward. He needed a rest for a period of time to raise his cultivation realm. Chapter 396. If Lu Xiaoyi wanted to hide and relax, he would have to see if the higher-ups agreed or not. At least in the Sword Chi Soaring Pavilion, a Foundation Establishment disciple actually managed to give birth to 3 sword spirits within 40 years of entering the sect. This kind of thing could greatly affect the future of the external sword, so they could not help but be concerned. The Jin Dan was already unable to deal with this matter, so in a situation where there was no result, they could only leave it to the higher-ups to make a decision. This was an expanded meeting, and 2 Jin Dan were fortunate enough to attend. Gu Gang represented the various halls under the Soaring Pavilion, and they were also the ones most familiar with cigarette butts. Gu Dong represented the Jin Dan directly under the Soaring Pavilion. In addition, there were several perfected Yuanying masters and a perfected lord of the Soaring Pavilion. They basically represented the upper echelons of the external sword. For a mere Foundation Establishment disciple, this lineup was a little too big, but if one considered the influence of sword spirits on the external sword, it was not excessive at all. A perfected master raised his head. Speak. What are the opinions of those below? You are all familiar with this person, so you have the right to voice your opinions. As the Jin Dan, directly under the Soaring Pavilion, Gu Dong was the first to speak. There is no need to talk about this person's strength, and there should be no problem with his loyalty. His origins are a little unclear. Although we know that he is a foreign cultivator, his past in his own domain is still a mystery. The perfected lord of the pavilion interrupted him. Regarding loyalty and origins, let's not discuss these. Due to some special reasons, when this person first entered the sect, his origins were already verified. He was jointly examined by the Soaring Pavilion's Pavilion Lord and the 3 Thunder Palace Lords, so there should be no doubts. Everyone was shocked. What kind of person was this? When he first entered the sect, he needed 4 perfected lords to personally examine him. Normally, new disciples would at most take a look at the Jin Dan. Even perfected Yuanying masters were too lazy to interfere, let alone perfected lords. Perhaps this was the reason why this person was so different. However, Gu Dong was a straightforward person. Even the words of a perfected lord could not stop him from voicing his opinion. Grandmaster is right. I am not suspecting him, but judging that his origins might be related to having so many sword spirits, 3 sword spirits in 40 years, this is not a coincidence. It must be some kind of necessity. I believe that all the martial uncles and grandmasters present here understand the significance of this better than I do. It will have a profound impact on my external sword lineage. After the sword battle, I asked him about it, but he said that he didn't know either. He just said that there was a high probability of creating a new sword spirit by killing a person. He has indeed killed many people since he entered the sect. They were all the elite disciples of the Supreme and 3 pure ones. Therefore, I don't doubt the truth of what he said. However, I still think that he must have some secrets that he hasn't told us yet. Otherwise, there is no way to explain this strange phenomenon. In my external sword lineage, I have killed many people, even more than him. Why can't they give birth to a sword spirit? I, Xian Yuan, have always protected the privacy of my disciples. This is also the rule of the cultivation world. However, there are differences in the size of the matter and the importance of the matter. When facing the future of the entire branch of the external sword, personal privacy should not be an obstacle. I think he must tell us his secret. Even if the sect has to take some special measures, we will not hesitate. Gu Gang couldn't help but say, "This disciple also has something to say. Speak." Gu Gang was a little impulsive. He didn't agree with Gu Dong's opinion. This old man was stubborn and always did good things wrong. He was famous in the external sword lineage for being smelly and stubborn. However, he didn't know it and thought that he was doing it for Xian Yuan. This disciple thinks that rules are rules. If you want to find a reason, then what rules can't be broken? Everyone has secrets. This is the common characteristic of cultivators. Grandmaster, you have it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to become a perfected lord. Martial uncles also have it. Otherwise, why are you able to travel the void? I also have secrets. Senior brother Gudong, you don't? Gudong straightened his neck. I don't have any secrets to the sect. Gu Gang sneered. Therefore, you can only die of old age on Jindan. Even the heavenly Tao looks down on a person who doesn't even have a secret. The perfected master frowned. Speak properly. No personal attacks. Swordsman meetings were very simple and crude. It wasn't rare for them to use words to fight. This was also one of the reasons why Dharma cultivators looked down on them. However, swordsmen persisted. Arguments often meant the truth. If everyone kept silent, this Tao tradition would lose its important vitality. Among the great cultivators of our Xian Yuan ancestors, there were countless ability users who didn't belong to the Xian Yuan Tao tradition. If we asked them to hand over their secrets for the benefit of Xuan Yuan's future development, then would they still stay in Xian Yuan? Whether it was the external Sword Boa Tower or the inner Sword Famlu Tower, they all had the insights left behind by various swordsmen. There were countless inheritances and all kinds of strange things with different origins. However, there was one thing in common. They were all voluntarily donated by our Xian Yuan swordsmen. None of them were forced by the sect. Xian Yuan had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. When had it ever relied on a divine art or secret technique? It was kind of spirit. If they felt that it was beneficial to the sect, then so be it. This was voluntary and not an obligation. If they felt that it was inappropriate, whether it was because they had made a promise to others or because of the cause and effect of the incident, or because they themselves were ambiguous. If they didn't donate, then so be it. Would Xian Yuan not be Xian Yuan because of this? Would they be defeated? I've interacted with Cigarette, but a lot since he entered the sect. If he says that he doesn't know, then he doesn't know. In the cultivation world, there are some mysteries and some inexplicable. How many people have figured it out after tens of thousands of years? I think that we don't have to care about this. If we investigate too much, it will chill the hearts of the disciples. After the two finished speaking, they fell silent. Xian Yuan encouraged everyone to speak up, but they couldn't be long-winded in front of their masters. Since they had already expressed the opinions of the two factions, the rest would be left to the seniors and masters. Everyone looked at the perfected master of the pavilion. He was the one who made the decision. In the cultivation world, one's realm represented one's insight. That couldn't be wrong. The perfected master didn't hesitate. Swordsmen had always done things decisively and rarely procrastinated. So, regarding the matter of the spirit on this child's sword, I will take charge of it. You don't have to interfere. Just treat it as if nothing happened. I only have one thing to say. The reason why Xin Yuan is strong is because we know that the only one who can defeat Xin Yuan is Xin Yuan ourselves. Therefore, any plan against our own people, even if it's under the guise of the sect, must be carefully considered. You can't be rash. The perfected master meant that everything related to this child would be left to him. The other Yuaning Jin Dan couldn't interfere. This was also a method. When the perfected master dealt with this kind of matter, he always had a way to do it without alerting the person involved. But from the meaning of his words, he still leaned towards Gu Gang's opinion. Only at their level would they know what tradition meant to a sect. It was something that must be protected. Seeing the two Jin Dan leave, the perfected master explained to the Yuaning below. If there's really a way for everyone to obtain a sword spirit, do you think it's a blessing or a curse for Xin Yuan? With tens of thousands of strong outer swordsmen comparable to the inner sword, it's only a matter of time before he can defeat the five-ring swordsman and dominate the universe. Blessings can't be enjoyed to the fullest. Power can't be used to the fullest. After the heavenly Tao gives you a sweet date, it will definitely be followed by a big stick. Chapter 397. External sword monarch Zhou Jiong waited for his disciples to leave before feeling troubled. Actually, no one was more eager than him for sword spirits to be popularized among ordinary external swords. With thousands of years of life, as a cultivator standing at the top of the pyramid, the more he experienced, the more he understood the pain and helplessness of being an external sword. Everyone had their own pride, even more so for cultivators. Then, what would a monarch's pride be like? No one was born to be a supporting character, or a supporting character. And he had been doing this for thousands of years. When he was in Foundation Establishment, he was the supporting character of the internal sword. When he was in Jin Dan, he was the supporting character of the internal sword Jin Dan. Now that he was a monarch, he was still the supporting character of the internal sword monarch. It wasn't just his head that was green, his heart was green. Even if not everyone had the chance to give birth to a sword spirit, some of them would be good. Even a small portion would be good. A sword spirit was too important to an external sword. It would help them understand the essence of the sword and avoid detours. They wouldn't need to waste too much time on useless skills when they were in Foundation Establishment Jin Dan. According to his understanding, if one could give birth to a sword spirit at Foundation Establishment, then more than half of the current system of external swords would be useless and wouldn't need to be learned. This would save at least a few hundred years of time for low and middle-level cultivators, the most precious few hundred years of time in the initial stage of cultivation. A few hundred years for a Foundation Establishment Jin Dan and a few hundred years for a monarch were completely different. The former was everything, while the latter was just a dispensable part. Therefore, although what he said was very traditional and righteous, he still wanted to know this secret in his heart. However, this kind of thing couldn't be done by those careless disciples under him. It was very easy to leave behind some loose ends, and if they couldn't deal with it cleanly, it would also cause harm to the little guy. He still wanted to do it himself. With the power of a monarch, he wouldn't disturb the little guy while secretly achieving his goal. But before that, he still wanted to ask for the opinion of a good friend. This little fellow was a little unusual. When he first entered the sect, he was questioned by the four true monarchs. At that time, the Soaring Heaven Pavilion Master, Gong Yao, was also present. Unfortunately, this fellow had ulcers on his butt and could not sit still. Since then, he had been gone for dozens of years without any news. According to the habits of cultivators at their level, he could not be counted on to return in the next few hundred years. Gong Yao had once mentioned this little guy when they were chatting, but he didn't mention it in detail. His fart was incomplete, which was why he was now in a dilemma. However, it didn't matter. He had friends in the Thunder Palace too. Vice Palace Master Gong Chung shared similar interests with him and had a good relationship with him. He was also one of the four true monarchs present at the time. There was no need for him to hide. He couldn't reveal his true colors in front of the younger disciples. But what couldn't he say in front of the true monarchs of the same generation? He was doing this for the sect, not for his own personal matters. He was not worried about the sword spirit now. With a sweep of his divine sense, he drifted to one Guangfeng, but he couldn't find him. He then expanded his divine sense to cover the entire dome, but he still couldn't find him. Where did this person go? Why didn't he go to the void of the universe? Since his divine sense couldn't find him, he could only send out a sword talisman. He immediately received a reply. "What's the matter, senior brother? Why are you in such a hurry? There's no purple clear, and there aren't many jade clear either. If there's nothing important, just leave a message." Zhou Jiang scolded jokingly. "I've only borrowed resources from you once, and it was an old matter from when I was in Foundation establishment. It's really hard for you to remember it for thousands of years. I have something that senior brother Gong Yao didn't mention in detail before he left. I'd like to ask about the specific situation back then." He briefly explained the changes in the sword battle inside and outside, including his desire to find out the true origins of this little guy's sword spirit. Gong Chung laughed. "What's the use of you finding out? Back in the Thunder Palace, it was junior brother Lu Feng, who was skilled in this aspect, who made a move. In the end, it was all for naught. What can you find out with that two-headed mental power of yours? However, that little guy's entry into the sect has nothing to do with us, but..." The more Zhou Jiang listened, the more curious he became. This little guy actually had such a miraculous ability. He'd only just entered the sect, but he could make the sword orb automatically avoid him when he tried to capture it. It was truly inconceivable. The Thunder Palace's ability to keep secrets was also impressive. He actually hadn't heard any news about this matter. However, from this point of view, that little guy was very likely telling the truth. He was able to give birth to a sword spirit not through some kind of martial arts, but because he possessed a mysterious ability in the unseen world. Even he himself couldn't figure it out. This kind of individual ability wasn't something that could be learned or imparted. It was a gift from the heavens, so he extinguished the idea of promoting it in the external sword world. However, this little guy was becoming more and more interesting to him. Gong Chung occasionally heard him mention old matters and was also somewhat curious. To be honest, the scene when he was choosing the sword orb was indeed strange. As time passed, he had somewhat forgotten about it, but now, senior brother, it's definitely useless for a Yin spirit like you to probe. I have a good idea here. It just so happens that Lu Zhu has returned to the dome during this period of time. We're also discussing Dao at Crow Peak. Why don't you bring your problem over? With Lu Zhu taking action, what can't be solved? Zhou Jiang's eyes lit up. Lu Zhu, not Lu Zhu. He was currently Xuan Yuan's strongest backer, his thigh. Born from the inner sword, he was known as the demon sword lord in the universe. He was a half-immortal figure, and he didn't walk the path of the blight state. He was a true almighty who had achieved Dao by severing corpses. Lu Zhu rarely returned. In 10,000 years, he had only returned twice or thrice. The time he stayed was also very short. However, this time was more coincidental. He had returned to the dome and lived for a few years. No one knew when he would leave. He often discussed Dao at Crow Peak with a group of perfected sovereigns. He also frequently went there himself. If this matter was mentioned to Lu Zhu, he could just treat it as a small episode in the dome. There was nothing inappropriate about it. This kind of small matter could be calculated by Lu Zhu. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly stopped. He suddenly realized that this bastard Gong Chung wasn't giving him a good idea. He was clearly taking the opportunity to find out why the sword orb was hiding from the little guy. Now he was using him as a front. He was careless in making friends. However, he really didn't have any better ideas at the moment. This was the most open and honorable move that wouldn't fall into the hands of others. Shaking his head, his figure flashed and disappeared without a trace. Recently, Crow Peak was often shrouded in heavy fog. The middle and low-level disciples didn't know what was going on. Only perfected Yuanying and other great cultivators knew the truth. This was Lu Zhu's preaching. It was a barrier set up to prevent low-level disciples from entering rashly. Lu Zhu was a serious person. He believed in teaching one level at a time. To him, if he imparted widely, it would be a formality with no meaning. Jin Dan taught Foundation establishment, while Yuanying taught Jin Dan. This was the right principle. When it came to him, He would usually preach Tao to the perfected sovereigns when he was free. Occasionally, he would extend it to Yuanying. It was very rare. For example, this time, it was a Dharma assembly specially for perfected sovereigns. Yuanying wasn't present. Almost all the perfected sovereigns of the inner and outer sword were present. Lu Zu's preaching was extremely rare. He wouldn't come back more than 3 times in 10,000 years. To many of them, this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It would be strange if they didn't cherish it. Chapter 398. When Zhou Jiang arrived at Crow Peak, he carefully lowered his body. No one dared to be presumptuous here because it involved a very important person. This person was comparable to the great emperor of Xianyuan. Even Lu Zu was respectful here. It was said that Lu Zu had been taught by this important person when he was young. Who knew if it was true or not? At the peak of Crow Peak, there were dozens of inner and outer sword perfected cultivators sitting around, listening to a Taoist lecture. The Taoist looked hazy from afar, but looked hazy from up close. It was as if he was right in front of you, but also as far away as the horizon. It gave off an unreal feeling. The body of a half-immortal was extraordinary. It was not something that a Yin spirit like him could understand. Obviously, he came a little late. Lu Zu's interest in the lecture was already gone, so he just casually glanced in his direction. "What's the matter?" Zhou Jiang knew that he was being asked, so he respectfully explained the mystery of the outer sword. At the end, he did not forget to drag Gong Chung into the conversation. Inner sword Gong Chung is also very curious as to why the sword pill avoided him, so he brought it up and asked for guidance from Lu Zu. Lu Zu nodded. He already knew the ins and outs of the matter. "Very good. You know how to keep people for your own selfish reasons. This is not only the tradition of Xianyuan, but also the tradition of cultivation. Greed comes from a heart, and there is no reason for it. The reason you think of now may just be a cover for your true thoughts. However, as swordsmen, we must be true to our words. Only then can our sword be clean." Zhou Jiang was sweating in his heart. He knew that his thoughts had been seen through by Lu Zu. He deserved it. Lu Zu did not blame him anymore. The fact that these perfected cultivators were able to tell the severity of the matter. Everyone made mistakes, and it was not entirely for personal gain. "Well, since both the inner and outer swordsmen have doubts, I will take a look. However, this is the last time. There will be no next time. Remember this." With a flick of his mind, his yang spirit left his body and circled around the foot of Qianxiu Peak. He returned in an instant and looked at the Xinjiang below. Only a very small number of them knew about this long ago. Most of them had just heard about it, but they were overflowing with interest. It was obvious that this was the first time they had heard of this situation. Actually, you've already guessed it. It's just a reincarnation phenomenon. Such a phenomenon will be very strong when one first starts cultivating. However, as time passes and one's realm increases, it will eventually return to normal. This is the true meaning of the heavenly Tao. It can't always be a blessing from the heavens. Everyone was enlightened. In fact, they also thought the same. If it wasn't a cultivation technique or a fortuitous encounter, then what else could it be? It could only be the secret of 3 lives. But what kind of secret of 3 lives is it that can cause a person to make the sword pill tremble, but could also give birth to a sword spirit? Wasn't this self-contradictory? If he had been a powerful spell cultivator in his previous life, would he have made the sword pill wary? If he had been a swordsman in his previous life, he would have been able to get close to the sword spirit. Was there such a precedent? Could the power of the previous life be brought to this life? Even the reincarnation of an immortal might not be able to do it, right? Then, was it a spell cultivator or a swordsman? An internal sword yang spirit was also very puzzled. He had a high position in the sect. Only a few people like him would ask Lu Zu so directly. Lu Zu sighed and said softly, "If the reincarnation wasn't a human consciousness, what if it was a sword spirit consciousness?" All the perfected cultivators were shocked. They had to admit that their vision was not as broad as Lu Zu's. Whether it was the sword pill of the internal sword or the sword spirit of the external sword, they would not exist alone after losing their master. The sword pill would return to the sword tomb through some special and mysterious channel to be refined again. Or it could not return due to the restrictions of the environment and would disappear with the passage of time. The sword spirit of the external sword would directly follow its master without any delay. Then an internal sword perfected cultivator said with a trembling voice, "Master Lu, what you mean is that he might be the sword pill of a certain superior cultivator in Xianyuan who accidentally reincarnated under special circumstances. Since that's the case, this person should belong to our internal sword lineage. If he was the reincarnation of a sword spirit, it would perfectly explain why those immature sword pills would avoid him when they were choosing their sword pills. This was not because they were afraid of that person, but because the sword pills had a natural fear of fierce sword spirits when they were in the early stages of adulthood. Why could he nurture a sword spirit when he was in the foundation establishment stage? That was because he was the reincarnation of a sword spirit. Perhaps it was not a brand new sword spirit at all, but a clone of the sword spirit of his original body. However, his words immediately angered an external sword perfected cultivator. He did not care that Lu Zhu was present and retorted, "What? You were an internal sword in your previous life, so you will be an internal sword in your next life? Can't you change your orthodoxy? According to this logic, everyone is a reincarnation, but no one is a swordsman. You should be a spell cultivator, body cultivator, ghost cultivator, because you were one in your previous life. We cultivators only look at the present world. We will be whatever we cultivate in this life. Even if you want to snatch someone, this is not how you snatch them, right? Only then did someone appear to be able to suppress your internal sword. But in the end, in your mouth, an old hen turned into a duck and became yours? If that's the case, can I turn your internal sword into an external sword, Wen Guangfeng? Anyway, no one knows what you cultivated in your previous life." The two perfected cultivators immediately confronted each other with tit for tat. Each of them had their own helpers, and the more they pulled, the more people there were. Of course, they did not use their swords, but their fists. This was also Xuanyuan's tradition. Lu Zhu sighed. It had been more than 10,000 years, but they were still the same. However, it was normal. When he was young, he would have already rubbed his arms, right? This kind of scene was more amiable and much more interesting than everyone sitting there and listening to his speech. His deterrence was still lacking. If senior brother was here, who would dare to be rough? He coughed lightly. Everyone knew that they had lost their composure, so they quickly quieted down. They were all old friends who had known each other for at least 1,000 years. They felt uncomfortable sitting on the dome without a fight. Taking advantage of the fact that there were no juniors watching, they could not use their swords and fists. Unfortunately, they did not have the chance. First of all, I'm only saying that there is such a possibility. It might not necessarily be the reincarnation of the sword spirit. There could be other reasons. The universe is vast, and the cultivation world is vast. Who can understand everything? It might not necessarily be the sword pill of the internal sword. It could also be the sword spirit of the external sword. How can there be a fixed rule for this so-called accident? Even if it is the reincarnation of the sword pill sword spirit, he must be Xuanyuan's. He could also be from Wei, Sword Mountain, Firmament Sword Sect, or other sword vein orthodoxies in the universe. The universe is vast, and there are countless orthodoxies. The swordsman is not the only one in the 5 rings. However, there's one point. This is a divine ability, an innate ability. It can't be replicated. Therefore, this matter ends here. Do what you want to do. Don't do anything intentionally because of what I said today. It's not good for this person, and it's also not good for Xianyuan. Chapter 399. P.S. This guy added it twice. Everyone nodded in agreement, but the discussion was still very heated. After all, this was a very novel topic, and it happened in the dome's own territory. For example, what realm did the sword spirit of the sword pill achieve such an incredible feat? In the end, everyone agreed that it should be at least above Yuanying. Or, was this person a human or a sword spirit? Similarly, everyone thought that he should be a human. He just had some spirituality of the sword pill. For example, would this person's ability really fade with the passage of time and the increase of realm? Then, if this person could reach the nascent soul stage, would he become an ordinary cultivator and not be the center of attention like he was now? Also, would the sword spirit be like a human and recover the memory of his previous life when he reached his original realm? If it was a Xianyuan swordsman, it would be fine. If he was too far away from his original orthodoxy and couldn't fly, it would be fine. But if it was the flying sword of a cultivator from Weijian Mountain or Firmament Sword Sect, the crowd left in the heated discussion. In the end, only one inner sword sun spirit remained. He was Guandu, the actual leader of Xianyuan Sword Sect and the person closest to the half-immortal realm. He guessed Lu Zhu's thoughts. Lu Zhu, are you still thinking about Senior Sister's reincarnation? Chong Lu sighed. For tens of thousands of years, he forced himself to forget many things, but there were many things that he could never forget. Senior brother, senior sister. He couldn't solve senior brother's problem. It was useless to think about it. Not to mention now, even if he finally succeeded in severing the corpse and became the only immortal in the past, present, and future, he still couldn't solve it. He couldn't reach senior brother's height. That was the only person he admired in his life. So, it was useless to think about it. He was thinking about senior sister, because this seemed to be within the scope of his ability. I'm thinking, where did senior sister reincarnate to? When will she appear? It's been thousands of years. Shouldn't she appear? The senior sister they were talking about was a very special figure among the high-level cultivators in Xianyuan. In terms of aptitude, ordinary cultivators could naturally be considered as geniuses. However, for top-notch characters like them, it was obviously ordinary. Therefore, they were always stuck on Yuaning, true monarch, and then reincarnated again. The reincarnation of a cultivator was a very illusory thing. It was basically uncontrollable. No sect would pay special attention to whether their own sect or their own star field had reincarnated. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. It was meaningless. It was purely a matter of luck. Therefore, if they left, they left. No one would consider bringing them back. There was no way to find this person. This was because he could exist in any star field in the universe. Furthermore, it was unknown how long it had been. Perhaps it had only been a few dozen years, or perhaps it had been hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of years. With so many cultivators around, how could they only remember one person? But Demon Lord will never forget, because he only has one senior sister. Moreover, this senior sister was very special. She had a unique ability. Every time she died, she would be able to find her way back home through a certain method. It was truly miraculous. The first time was when she died in the Great War of Heavenly Wolf. She was only Yuanying. Later, she was brought back by senior brother. The second time was when she was Een spirit. She didn't manage to survive. As a result, thousands of years later, she became a true monarch and found her way back. Demon Lord believed that senior sister would definitely come back for the third time. This was his intuition. He was looking forward to it. Because he was so lonely, he had no real friends or relatives. Senior brother and senior sister were the only two people who could scold him regardless of their realms. Now, he really missed the feeling of being scolded. He couldn't use the power of Xianyuan to find her. That was too selfish. A meaningless search would bring a burden to Xianyuan. For him, the best way was to wait. Wait for senior brother and senior sister. Senior brother was unreliable, and the matter was too big. Even a half-immortal like him didn't dare to think about it. But what realm would senior sister be when she came back this time? Would she be a half-immortal or a sun god? Senior sister had the toughest spirit among all the cultivators he had ever seen. Many men couldn't compare to her. He still remembered what senior sister said when she first came back to Xianyuan. If the spirit is willing, we will meet again in the next life. If the spirit is willing, take me back to Xianyuan. He had been waiting in Xianyuan for nearly 10,000 years, waiting to see her again. This was one of the main reasons why he occasionally came back to Xianyuan. When Guandu also left, Demon Lord's expression slowly became dignified. He didn't lie to these true monarchs. What he said was basically his own judgment, but there was one thing he didn't say, and that was his intuition. His body flashed, and he had already entered a certain space. He clasped his hands. Jiu Yi, Xiaolu is here to see you, a Jew said unhurriedly. Although his realm was not as good as the Xianyuan Taoist in front of him, he was older. Moreover, the Taoist in front of him used to be his master's little brother. Naturally, he had the qualifications to put on airs. Xiaolu, we haven't seen each other for thousands of years. What do you think of Jiu Yi? I think you're up to no good. Jiu Yi, am going to sleep. I don't have time to entertain you. Demon Lord knew his temper, but he wasn't angry. There were very few people who used to be his old friends, but none of them were human. Jiu Yi, Baiyan, Shu, Lu Yin, and so on, none of them had a normal temper. I'm here to chat with Jiu Yi. I'll be leaving in a few days. I don't know when we'll meet again, so I'm here to say goodbye to you. A Jew looked at him vigilantly. Speak human language. You're almost 20,000 years old. Don't learn from your unreliable senior brother. After a few rounds, you've already tricked Jiu Yi. Demon Lord was still smiling. He didn't think that it was rude for a true monarch to talk to a half-immortal like him. A Jew was much older than him. The key was that this guy talked to his master, his senior brother, in the same way. Jiu Yi, I just want to know, in recent years, there have been countless new disciples in Xianyuan. Is there anyone that Jiu Yi likes? A Jew was even more vigilant. He was a little slow, but he wasn't stupid. As soon as Demon Lord opened his mouth, he knew what this swordsman wanted to ask. All the creatures in the universe had their own strengths. Humans were the smartest, but in terms of some mysterious perception, a realm spirit like him was countless streets ahead of humans. Even if Demon Lord had a half-immortal body, if Baiyan was here, and the Phoenix was here, he would have his own judgment and would not ask him for confirmation. He had an obligation to keep the little fellow's secret. In his opinion, although Demon Lord was his master's closest and most trustworthy friend, he was different from a realm spirit like him and a sword spirit like the little fellow. In the end, Demon Lord had never been with his master day and night. They were the only ones who were with his master day and night. Half-immortals were not immortals. How could they understand the things of immortals, including the sword pill and the innate great Tao that carried it? They were the only ones for his master. And humans were too complicated and fickle. Before the little fellow truly grew up, he would not talk about this with any humans. In a Jew's heart, who could be trusted? Wu Feng, Lu Yin, Baiyan, these are the first level. Phoenix, Fox, Black Dragon, Wild Boar, these were the second level. As for humans, even if they were close to Demon Lord, he still had to be on guard. Because humans were the smartest. Humans needed to climb up in the shortest time possible. Therefore, they would resort to any means necessary. Not to mention Demon Lord. Even if his master's wife came, he would still keep it a secret. This was the essence of a realm spirit. The only one. Exclusive. Maybe he would lose something, but there would never be an unnecessary accident. His long life of hundreds of thousands of years had taught him that accidents were often the so-called trust. They were different. They had a long life, so their understanding of loyalty was above that of humans. He thought so. Chapter 400. He pretended to be confused. Xiaolu, what are you trying to say? Xuanyuan's new disciple? What does that have to do with me? Could it be that I can be their master? Demon Lord was not in a hurry. Jiu Yi, in the recent group of Xuanyuan's disciples, did you find a more special existence? Your perception is not something we humans can compare to. You can easily find some mysterious connections that are beyond human understanding. For example, a person called Lu Xiaoyi? Ajio was already prepared, and his face was very thick. Lying was never difficult for him. These were all forced by his 6 eyes brothers. Lu Xiaoyi? I know that. He just entered the sect a few years ago, but he came to the 9-palace world to participate in the internal and external sword testing. Well, a very special external sword, but I can't tell what's special about it. However, Xianyuan has hundreds and thousands of new disciples every year. After coming to the Nine-Palace world for more than 10,000 years, won't there be millions of them? There are many special ones. There are demon cultivators who pretend to be human, ghost cultivators who take over the nest, and weapon spirits who control the main consciousness, and so on. Lousy will not say anything. Let them judge by themselves. As for what you said, it's just one of the countless special ones. It's none of my business. What? Do you have a grudge with him? Demon Lord smiled bitterly. What grudge can I have with a little foundation stage cultivator? I just saw his outstanding performance, so I asked. Since Jiuyi doesn't know, it doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. In addition, don't forget the matter I entrusted to Jiuyi. Senior sister is not only kind to me, but also to senior brother. I hope to give her a slightly better environment. Jiu breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, this kid didn't get to the bottom of it. He put all his thoughts on his senior sister and ignored the real big fish. I was thinking about it, but it's not as convenient for me to do it as old man Guan do. There's no time, so how can it be so easy to find? Look at the job you found for me. I only ask for your help occasionally, but this matter of yours has dragged me on for thousands of years. When Demon Lord heard the song, he immediately handed over a storage ring. I know that Jiuyi is very lonely in the Jiugong world and has no chance to go out. Xiao Lu has some spiritual energy here. Jiuyi can eat it like candy. Jiu immediately beamed with joy. She immediately snatched the storage ring and weighed it in her hand. A few more wrinkles appeared on her face. Don't worry, your business is my business. If I, a Jew, am lazy, let me be struck by lightning. Demon Lord sighed and shook his head. In the end, he didn't say anything. He left the realm. He had an intuition, but it was not confirmed here. In fact, he had a way to get the truth, whether it was from Lu Xiaoyi or a Jew. But he was unwilling to do so. This was a form of respect. A Jew might not be telling the truth. From a moment he took over this boundary spirit, he knew that this silly and fat guy was not a good person. He was very strange. Why were all the people around his senior brother this kind of trash? But he still did not want to use force. First, it was because of his senior brother's face. Second, he knew that his thoughts were too illusory. Instead of saying it was an intuition, it was better to say it was a kind of expectation. It was better to focus on his senior sister. As for this little sword cultivator, he was very happy that there was a talent in Xinyuan Weijian, but that was all. Every year, there would be talents in Xinyuan Weijian, so it didn't matter if there was one more. The path of cultivation was long and difficult. Who could say for sure how far one could go? This was just a problem he solved when he returned to the fifth ring. For him, what was more important was his own cultivation. When he left this time, he did not know if he would be able to come back. This was his last few thousand years. It was time to make a decision. The fifth ring was very stable now. He was luckier than his senior brother. The sect did not cause him many obstacles and troubles during his growth, allowing him to focus on his own cultivation. If he floated up, when would he be able to return? The higher his realm, the more he understood the loneliness and the more he understood why his senior brother had made such a decision. If it was him, what would he do? Lu Xiaoyi was completely quiet this time. After he displayed his strength in front of everyone, the biggest benefit was that the number of people who wanted to test their swordsmanship decreased by 99%. The remaining few were still immersed in training. They were all from the inner sword. In the outer sword, all the mountains were small. The battle with the light faction had left a deep impression on him. If it was a life and death battle outside, he might not necessarily win. That was because Light insisted on using mid-range flying swords to end the battle. In reality, the swordsman had many other methods. Without the help of the host, an enlightened master, even if he could win, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. This made him finally understand his true position on the fifth ring foundation establishment leaderboard. To put it bluntly, the 11th place was just right. He really did not have the ability to enter the top 10. But just because he did not have the ability now did not mean that he would not have the ability 10 years later. He had a deeper understanding of himself and was glad that he was walking on the right path. Cultivation was the key. He could not relax. It not only represented his endurance, but also his explosive power. The cultivation of the sword spirit could not be lax. He could kill an ordinary expert with a single strike, but once he reached a certain level, his opponent would be able to defend against his first strike. Then, he would not have many follow-up moves to deal with him. Actually, he still had an advantage over Light. He had a lot of room for improvement in many aspects, such as cultivation, sword force, and sword spirit. Light, on the other hand, had none. He had already reached his peak. For example, how much more could his terrifying sword frequency be improved? Unless the sword light split. But that was an ability that only Jean Dan could bear. Now, he could enjoy the benefits of victory. Guming led him and kept nagging. The inner treasury is different from the outer treasury. We can't just take everything we see. We are swordsmen, not beggars. Every sword embryo, every material, has its own range of application, sword attribute, and cultivator realm. So to be honest, with your current realm, it's actually more suitable for you to go to the outer treasury than the inner treasury. Most of the things that are suitable for foundation establishment are in the outer treasury. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. So your promise to let me go to the inner treasury was just an empty promise? You know that I can only look and not use it. Is it more practical than entering the top 4? Guming laughed dryly. The main thing is that it's an honor. You could be considered someone who has been to the inner treasury. In the Dome Peak, there aren't many people who receive this kind of treatment. Even though I'm a Jean Dan, I've only been to the inner treasury twice. There are still restrictions. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. These external sword masters were all pretty good. Sometimes they might have their own selfish motives, but when it came to treating their disciples, they were still very dedicated. This was probably why they were chosen to be in such positions. There were more than 1,000 external sword Jean Dan disciples in Qinxiu Peak, but only a few could be promoted to Yuanying. The rest had to think about their own future. Taking up a position in Chongxiao Peak was a very good choice. Worshipping was secondary. The most important thing was that they had the opportunity to interact with talented disciples. Who knew who would reach where in the end? If one or two of them were successful, they would be able to solve their problems, especially those who had family ties. Connections were also a kind of resource. Chapter 401. Little E, don't forget to thank your martial Uncle Gu Gang after this. There was some controversy in the sect about you giving birth to a sword spirit. It was your martial Uncle Gu Gang who fought for you that you didn't become the subject of the sect's research. Of course, the upper echelons of the sect wouldn't be so short-sighted as to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. But with this intention, you still have to know. Lu Xiaoyi said seriously, it's not just martial Uncle Gu Gang, right? I know that the martial uncles of the various halls are all speaking up for me. Gu Gang, Gu Shan, Gu Chuan, and that includes you. I actually also know that the martial uncles of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion just haven't had any contact with me, so they don't know me. That's why they have some ideas. I don't blame them. Don't worry. In fact, if I knew that someone had a unique method, I would also want to know. And I'm afraid that it would be for myself, not for the sect like the martial uncles. Gu Ming's old heart was comforted. Sensible children always made people particularly fond of them. You didn't even need to point them out for them to know what you meant. This was the true appearance of a cultivator. The way they conducted themselves was also a kind of Tao. It was a bit mysterious. Let me tell you a secret. The old Jean Dan cultivator who guides you is an old miser. He treats the things in the inner treasury as more important than the sky. He's like a country bumpkin, wishing that he could only get in and not get out. He's been in charge of the inner treasury for many years. No one is more familiar with the treasures in the inner treasury than him. When he's nervous, he doesn't show it on other aspects, but the scar on the back of his neck will be especially red and shiny. The more nervous he is, the redder it gets. He's afraid that someone will take away his treasures. This is a problem he got when he was injured in a fight. He can't control it. Whether the things are good or bad, you can use this as a warning. I guarantee that everything you take out will be good. Lu Xiaoyi understood tacitly. This sentence was more practical than the countless sentences before it. Coming to the inner treasury, the usual procedure was to verify his identity, check his qualifications, and explain the quantity. Gu Ming had promised that he could enter the inner treasury, but he didn't say that he could take whatever he wanted. He was also restricted here, unlike in the outer storehouse where he could do whatever he wanted. However, there were too many people who were qualified to go to the outer storehouse. What good things could be left in there? Lu Xiaoyi strolled around the outer storehouse for an entire day, but he only received 2 sword embryos and the corresponding materials. They were not even as good as the top-grade goods sold in the official market. It was very disappointing. Swordsmen did not care much about resources, especially inner swords. However, it was different for outer swords. At the very least, flying swords could not be saved. It was equivalent to a spell cultivator's life-bound ritual implement. Who would be willing to save money on it? Therefore, there was a saying in the cultivation world that a swordsman was a magic cultivator who used a flying sword as a magic weapon. In fact, there was a certain degree of truth in this saying. A sword had a sword spirit, and a magic tool had a magic tool spirit. Strictly speaking, a magic tool of a magic cultivator might not be as sharp as a flying sword, but it was far superior in other aspects. Therefore, having a few flying swords in an external sword was actually the same as having more magic tools refined by a magic cultivator. This was the reason why an external sword was slightly inferior to a spell cultivator from a top-grade sect. This was also the reason why so many high-level cultivators had their eyes on Lu Xiaoyi for him to be able to produce a sword spirit. It was difficult to produce a sword spirit, but it was also not easy to produce a magic tool spirit. This was one of the fundamental reasons that determined the strength of a low-level cultivator. Just based on this point alone, Lu Xiaoyi was actually not that outstanding. He also knew this, so he had been working hard. But what he didn't fully understand was his innate talent for battle. This was even more important than the birth of a sword spirit. Lu Xiaoyi's flying swords were still of decent quality. Other than the first sword, the 4 Seasons, which was slightly inferior, the rest were either from Gu Bei's private collection or from the official market. This was not something that he could save money on. He was also considering using some precious materials to make up for the lack of quality of the sword embryo in the future. This was a matter for the future, but for now, of course, it was more practical to choose a better sword embryo. In the future, there would be less of such trouble. The stingy old man that Gu Ming had mentioned was called Tian Gao. He looked like a very normal old cultivator, but the Tian generation was 1 generation older than the Gu generation. He was a true Jin Dan elder, a character who would kick the bucket any day. He carefully examined Lu Xiaoyi, his expression uneasy. Probably everyone who came to the palace treasury was his enemy. This mentality, guarding this place, was just right, but he was also loyal to his duty. He would not forget his responsibility because of disgust. He led the way in front. Lu Xiaoyi, who was behind him, intentionally or unintentionally, glanced at the back of his neck. Sure enough, there was a brown scar the size of a copper coin. "What do you want?" Tian Gao asked woodenly. Lu Xiaoyi replied calmly, "Sword embryo." Every swordsman who entered a place like this would have this as their first choice. It was normal. Unlike a magic cultivator, there were many choices. Magical instruments, talismans, pills, formations, spiritual beasts, and so on. Tian Gao led him into a stone hall. Here, hundreds of flying swords were placed on individual sword racks. Some were sparkling, some were ancient, some were heavy and restrained, some were sharp on the outside. 100 swords was much less than Lu Xiaoyi had expected. His consciousness was still stuck on the concept of tens of thousands of swords in Bo Ao Tower. However, this was not a wholesale market. This was the palace treasury. Only the best of the best could enter. It could not be compared to the so-called best of the best in the outer treasury and the official market. Tian Gao looked at the eager young swordsman and smiled coldly. The rules of the palace treasury state that if you want to take a sword, you must first use your spiritual sense to take it. If you can take it, it is yours. If you can't, it is not yours. No matter what reward you receive, It must be placed under the rules of the palace treasury. Do you understand? Lu Xiaoyi felt as if a bucket of cold water had been poured on him. He laughed dryly and said, I understand. I will follow the rules. This was to restrict cultivators from taking the most valuable items. The items here range from foundation establishment to monarch. Of course, the items that could be used by monarchs were the most valuable. What was the point of a small foundation establishment cultivator taking all these? What if he could not use them? He could only hoard them. This would lose the original meaning of the reward. Therefore, the restriction was actually reasonable. The principle was that you should take what you could use and look at what you could not use. Don't think too much about it. If it was a greedy person, they would try to absorb every single flying sword, and then observe if the quality of the swords that could be absorbed matched their characteristics. Of course, in the end, they would have to take a look at the scar on Tian Gao's neck. However, Lu Xiaoyi was never a greedy person. He never was. He had his own unique understanding of swords. Between the quality of a sword and whether it was easy for a sword to come to life, he obviously valued the latter more, because only the life of a flying sword could allow the flying sword to be reborn. Only then could he proceed to the next step of transformation. If the quality was good and the materials were precious, but it was not compatible with him, then what was the use? Could it be that he would be like Gu Bei and keep it until he died? Up until now, he had already produced 4 sword spirits. Although he still did not completely understand the essence of the sword, he still had his own understanding of some superficial things. For example, the attributes of a flying sword, the materials used, the direction of the technique. He was very clear on what kind of flying sword was most suitable for him. Chapter 402. After looking at all of the 179 flying swords, Heavens was surprised that this little sword cultivator didn't try to absorb them one by one. Instead, he only picked less than 50 of them and tried to absorb them. This was very surprising because among the other 100 flying swords, there were obviously some that could be used by foundation establishment cultivators, but he was not tempted at all. Tian Gao knew that this little swordsman had great wisdom and was able to restrain his greed. Even some Jindan cultivators could not achieve such a state of mind, but he was able to do it. His future was limitless. This was a trap from the start. With the strength of a foundation establishment cultivator's soul, it was impossible for him to absorb all the flying swords. If he harbored such greed, he would run out of energy before he could even absorb half of the swords. How could he continue? He would not tell this to the little swordsman. He had no obligation to do so. Tian Gao continued to observe. Out of the 50 flying swords, he could not absorb most of them. He did not use brute force either. If he could not absorb them, he would give up. He also did not pester. This was self-awareness, which was very rare in foundation establishment. Only 6 swords could be absorbed by Lu Xiaoyi. He carefully chose 3 of them. This was the limit. Otherwise, he would not be practicing the sword, but selling it. There was nothing to consider. After practicing the sword for 40 years, he was still hesitating when choosing a sword embryo. Did he learn from a dog? He took the 3 sword embryos. Senior, I've chosen. Shall we go look at the materials? Tian Gao did not move. He narrowed his eyes. What? You're not going to look at the scar on the back of my neck? Lu Xiaoyi was stunned. He was immersed in the flying swords and had forgotten about it. However, this martial uncle Tian Gao was very embarrassed. He could only laugh dryly. It was not easy to explain. You're able to stay true to your heart and not be greedy. Very good. You know that I'm stingy and that my weakness is the scar on the back of my neck. Yet, you can choose to ignore it. Very good. Lu Xiaoyi knew that this was because he was staring at the back of Tian Gao's neck when he came in. Although he felt that he was already very careful under the senses of Jindan cultivators, there was nothing that could be hidden from them. Hey, do you really think you can pick something good like this? I purposely left a hole for them to crawl through. He thought that he had picked something amazing, but it was all trash, and yet he was so proud of it. That Gu Ming, did he tell you something in a very mysterious manner outside? He thinks I'm stupid? I think he's the one who's really stupid. High heavens, can't bear to part with these things. They were all painstakingly piled up with resources. Of course, they should be left to those who are truly worthy of them. What's the point of giving good things to those who want to take advantage of others or play tricks? He snorted again, as if he had a lot of opinions about the atmosphere in the sect. However, he didn't continue to say anything. Instead, he pointed at the 3 flying swords in his hand. Of the 3 you picked, one is the spatial sword, one is the mysterious sword, and one is the flame sword. I want to ask you why you chose them. Do you have the ability to use this kind of power now? Since you can become the Foundation Establishment Senior Brother of the external sword, you must have your own unique things. Just based on the characteristics of these 3 flying swords, there are actually 2 that are better than the ones you picked. I reckon that you can also absorb them. Are you willing to take a look? Lu Xiaoyi was overjoyed. He thanked Tian Gao with a serious expression before walking towards the 100 or so flying swords that he had overlooked. The so-called spatial sword was actually made from materials that were mixed with many precious spatial materials. It was beneficial for the use of spatial skills. Of course, it wasn't impossible to use it as a normal flying sword, but it would be a waste of natural resources. In the same way, the mysterious sword was made from materials that could help swordsmen gain some mysterious abilities when refining swords. For example, Lu Xiaoyi wanted to develop the ball of luck in his sea of consciousness. Even if he couldn't do it now, he would definitely be able to do it in the future. He needed to plan ahead and prepare early. At the very least, he needed to go through a period of time where he could cultivate a sword spirit. Only then would he think about how to use the ball of luck. This would save him the trouble of having to cultivate a sword spirit from scratch when things really came to a head. He still didn't understand what a sword spirit was. If he really needed it, what if he couldn't cultivate a sword spirit? As for why he chose a fire attribute sword, the reason was the same as why he chose Yu 10 years ago. He chose Yu because the water attribute was the most common in this cultivation world. He chose this fire attribute sword because it was the best weapon for breaking through dirt, poison, and miasma. As for the 5 elements, this was a hurdle that every cultivator had to cross. The reason why Lu Xiaoyi wasn't interested in it before was because he knew that his understanding of the 5 elements was very limited. It would be better to use strength to achieve results. This was also the cultivation principle of cultivators in the Foundation Establishment stage. In his 6 battles with the inner sword, there wasn't a single inner sword that used an elemental flying sword. Perhaps there were some subtle metal attribute techniques, but there wasn't a single water, fire, wind, thunder, ice, or earth attribute. This was because they hadn't reached the true threshold of using the 5 elements. If they had the time and energy, they might as well use it directly on strength. However, if a cultivator had a long-term plan, the 5 elements would definitely be included in it. Lu Xiaoyi was just one step ahead, learning the most common water and fire attributes first. After all, these 2 attributes were very practical. Tian Gao was pretending to be a pig to eat a tiger, eating a chicken. The scar on the back of his neck was probably deliberately exposed for others to see. For a Jin Dan like him, controlling the blood flow at the scar to make it brighter and redder was simply too easy. Who knew how he did it, revealing this little trap? Even a home master like Gu Ming had fallen for the evil trick and believed it without a doubt. Those who could endure until Jin Dan were indeed not easy to deal with. Each and every one of them was a cunning old fox. Tian Gao walked in front of a sword rack, indicating for him to use his divine sense to grab it. This person placed great importance on rules. If Lu Xiaoyi couldn't grab it, then he definitely wouldn't give it to him. Tian Gao's judgment was not bad. Lu Xiaoyi easily grabbed the flying sword. Seeing Tian Gao standing to the side without saying anything, he knew that this was testing his eyesight and knowledge. Thus, he carefully used his divine sense to examine it, unlike at the beginning when he was just glancing around. The first feeling this flying sword gave off was that it was somewhat ghostly, which is why Lu Xiaoyi gave up on it the first time he scanned it. However, when he focused all his attention on it, he discovered that under the ghostly aura on the surface, there was a very special flame attribute that overflowed from within. This is the Een Fire Sword. Tian Gao nodded his head in satisfaction. Dafa's direction is correct, but it's not Een Fire. Heaven and earth have strange flames. Nirvana, divine flame. True sun fire. Forget it. I can't tell you these. These are all things you can only come into contact with after yuaniing. There's no need to talk about the effects of these divine flames. They can burn all the ghosts in the world. For foundation establishment, the types of flames that can be used are very limited. They are very low level. Even a normal 3 true fire cannot be used. Most of them are mortal flames. Their effect in breaking ghosts is very limited. The flying sword you chose can only emit mortal flames in the end. There are a lot of techniques in the Boa Tower, but there's nothing new about it. It's of little value. However, the material of this flying sword is very special. Together with the Boa Tower's phantom sword technique, it can emit a very high-quality Een fire among the low-level flames. Phantom ghost fire. No matter if it's killing people or breaking ghosts, it's much better than mortal flames. I'm guessing that you chose the fire sword to break the barrier. Then this thing is much more meaningful than the one you chose. Of course, it's also much more precious. Chapter 403. P.S. Thank you for your hard work. Actually, I don't know what the map looks like either. Lu Xiaoyi accepted Sky's good intentions and listened to his advice. Jindan's foresight was not something he could compare to. Even if he was very confident in his own sword technique system, it was impossible for a sword technique system to exist out of thin air. It had to be built upon many foundations, and this was the strength of Jindan. Breaking through barriers did not necessarily require the use of the so-called godly flames, heavenly flames, true flames, or sacred flames. This was a misunderstanding. Actually, some heterodox flames were quite effective in breaking through barriers, especially in the middle and lower stages of a cultivator. They were still unable to grasp those high and mighty flames. The phantom willow, the wisp, was such a thing. It was a very high-grade flame among the low-grade flames. One cannot look down on it just because of its name. Just like those high and mighty flames, it was also from the orthodox Taoism. It was not something that some sneaky orthodoxy would secretly create in their tombs. The second flying sword was still easily taken out. It seemed like Sky was very familiar with the realm of the flying sword here. He was also very clear about the mental strength of this little swordsman in front of him. Lu Xiaoyi pondered over it carefully, but did not discover anything. This flying sword did not seem to have any special features on the surface. After careful examination, there was nothing special about it. Perhaps Lu Xiaoyi's knowledge was limited. His knowledge of materials and tombs was indeed lacking. He was well aware of this. There was only one point. The flying sword's material was very special. It was layered, and the internal structure was complex. It seemed to have its own mysteries. It felt like a beehive, but it was not completely so. It was not as orderly as a beehive. Knowing that he would not be able to recognize it, Sky smiled. This is the space epic stacking stone. Although it looks ordinary, it is a true top-grade material. There is only one of it in the inner treasury. There is no other. Many cultivators who entered the inner treasury were tempted by it. Hee, I used the scar on the back of my neck to trick them. There are many types of space swords: positive space, negative space, alternate space, subspace, and so on. Even if I tell you now, you won't understand. To be honest, even I don't understand it. Only when you reach the level of a monarch can you have a deep understanding of the true power of space. However, this doesn't prevent us from using it. Even if we don't understand the root of it, it's still good to be able to use it. The material of this flying sword was the rare folded space. In the Boa Tower, there was only one sword technique that corresponded to it, the stacked paper slash. No one cultivated this sword art, because it had very high requirements for flying swords. How could there be a finished product on the market? In comparison, folding space was faster and stealthier, and the spatial fluctuations were smaller. It was a true sneak attack. If a sword spirit is born, He, Lu Xiaoyi bowed deeply. Thank you for your help, martial uncle. I have nothing to repay you with. Tian Gao interrupted him. What do I need from you? I'm not giving you this because I want to repay you. It's because you've brought hope to the external sword sect. You have the temperament. This is one of the reasons. You are most likely to give birth to a sword spirit. And this is the second reason. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, you allowed the external sword lineage to turn the tables. This is the third reason. Good things should be given to the right people. That's my philosophy. I'm also an external sword, and I'm also disappointed by the state of the external sword. Since you've given me hope, I won't hesitate to make you even stronger. If it was someone else, I would have given him a single strand of hair. Lu Xiaoyi was deeply moved. Speaking of which, he had entered the Xianyuan External Sword School for 40 years, and had come in contact with many of the External Sword School's martial uncles, Jin Dan. From the beginning, he had felt that the External Sword School's elders were too selfish, and there were some who were inexplicably against him. However, as he slowly came in contact with them, he realized that these martial uncles were actually very good people. Gu Gang, Gu Shan, Gu Chuan, Gu Ming, Tian Gao, and even the strict and old-fashioned Gu Dong of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. He began to slowly accept his identity as an external swordsman. The reason he fought for first place in the internal and external swordsmanship battle was also because of this change in feelings, and not just because of some reward. No one would be dead set on joining a sect the moment they entered, especially a foundation establishment cultivator who already had a completely independent personality and worldview. This required a process. A good sect, a strong inheritance, and a long history of orthodoxy could achieve all of this. Xianyuan Sword School was such a place. Lu Xiaoyi really liked the sword of sneak attack. In his personal philosophy, he felt no guilt towards sneak attacks. Therefore, his third sword spirit was hidden fragrance. It would wander around the periphery of the battlefield, looking for an opportunity to launch a surprise attack. However, in later battles, he realized that hidden fragrance's usefulness was not that great. In other words, it was far from being able to catch the opponent off guard as described in swordsmanship. In battle, every cultivator's divine sense was in a state of high alert. The closer it was to them, the tighter their defenses. Basically, within 200 feet, even a needle would not be able to escape a cultivator's perception. Therefore, the meaning of hidden fragrance's existence was greatly reduced. It was very difficult for it to be used perfectly in a formal battle. Only then did he think of refining a true sort of sneak attack for himself. And the best sort of sneak attack was nothing other than space. Now that he had already chosen 3 flying swords, he suddenly realized a problem. He only had the flying swords, but he did not have the time to go to the Boa Tower to look for swordsmanship. Therefore, he was completely clueless as to what materials were used to inscribe the sword array. If he went to the Boa Tower to look for swordsmanship, when he returned, would he still be allowed to enter the inner treasury? Tian Gao clearly understood his misgivings. He was used to this kind of situation. In fact, this was also an unspoken way that the inner treasury restricted cultivators from taking too many things. Unless you knew what sword was suitable for you before entering the inner treasury, and were familiar with the swordsmanship beforehand and knew what materials would be used. Let's go. I'll take you to the material storage. The sect only allows you to enter the inner treasury once, so you can only enter once. This is the rule, but this rule is unfair to you. They should not be so stingy towards someone who has contributed greatly to the outer sword. I don't know much about that mysterious sword of yours, but I know very well the materials needed to inscribe the other 2 flying swords. I'll give you a list, and you can take them yourself. Take note, because of the limited quantity, don't take the common materials that are available outside. Only take the key materials that are not available outside. Under Tian Gao's guidance, Lu Xiaoyi successfully obtained the materials he needed the most. Tian Gao also gave him the highest quantity limit. Lu Xiaoyi thanked him again. He did not know what to say. When it came to thanking others, his sharp tongue had become very clumsy. Tian Gao, however, was very natural. He waved his hand. Every elder of the outer sword would do this. This is the tradition of our outer sword, including that fool Gu Ming. Also, do you know what to say when you see him? Lu Xiaoyi held back his laughter and nodded. When he left the inner treasury, Tian Gao left with a huff. Gu Ming came up to him. How was it? Did you choose to your liking? Is Tian Gao's neck accurate? Lu Xiaoyi said with a straight face. Master's words are too accurate. Every time, when it comes to precious objects, the scar on the back of Master's neck would be especially bright red. Based on this, I chose rare items. Didn't you see that Master's Tian Gao was very unhappy just now? Gu Ming laughed happily. That's right, it hurts that old bastard. Chapter 404. P.S. What's wrong with little Jixin today? You're trying to kill me. Lu Xiaoyi returned with a full harvest. He hadn't cultivated a new sword spirit for 10 years, so he hoped he could gain something in the remaining 10 years. He didn't ask for much, just one. Big Dipper, Transforming Rain, Phantom Travel, Origami, and Mystic. He had already cultivated the first two for 10 years, and he could start working on the last two immediately. As for how Mystic was related to chasing luck in his mind, that would depend on his luck. He went to see a few elders, and he had to pay a visit to the halls of Soaring Sky Pavilion to explain his recent situation. He went to the Ascension Hall, the Inscription Hall, the Dark Hall, and even to Gu Dong of Soaring Sky Pavilion. He was no longer an ordinary Foundation Establishment cultivator, but the eldest senior brother of 20,000 Outer Sword Foundation Establishment cultivators. Now that his status was different, he had the right to visit the eldest senior brother. At certain times, when the eldest senior brother was powerful, even the various halls had to cooperate with him. His current situation showed signs of developing in this direction, because he was not only the eldest senior brother of the external swords, but also the eldest senior brother of the external swords in Xianyuan, although the external swords didn't admit it. This kind of disciple had a boundless future. Once he could form a Jin Dan, his fighting power would reach a level that other external swords couldn't compare to. If he could form a nascent soul, he would certainly lead Soaring Sky Pavilion. If he reached the level of a monarch, it was hard to say. Such a person, whether for public or private reasons, it was necessary to establish good karma with him. Gu Dong led him to the highest point on the 13th floor of Soaring Sky Pavilion. In principle, even Jin Dan couldn't come to this place, but now the monarch of Soaring Sky Pavilion wasn't here, and the rules weren't as strict as when it was first built. At the foot of Thousand Virtues Peak, snow and wind were blowing, and heaven and earth were boundless. The magnificent and vast view made people's eyes clear, and their hearts open a lot. Do you hold a grudge against me for asking the school to thoroughly investigate the origin of your sword spirit? Gu Dong asked directly. Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently, I'm not holding a grudge. Your insistence on such a meaningless investigation may delay everyone's time. In the end, nothing will be accomplished. You won't be able to obtain the sword spirit, and you won't be able to do anything. Why bother? Gu Dong was still insistent. You may be right, but as long as we persist, we will definitely find a way to change reality. Even if we fail thousands of times, as long as we succeed once. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Are you sure that external swords will have many opportunities like this? The only result of your actions is that more and more people with their own secrets and special abilities will leave Xianyuan because they don't want to be treated as lab rats. There would never be any outstanding talents in external swordplay because every talent would be sliced into pieces. Only the most ordinary of cultivators could survive here and become the most ordinary of golden core cultivators, the most common of nascent soul cultivators, and the most insignificant of true monarchs. Year after year, you will repeat the sorrow of the past. You will hate the unfairness of the heavens, hate the lack of luck, hate the lack of fate, but you don't know that it is you who have destroyed your own hope. Does an orthodoxy that doesn't tolerate heresy, doesn't encourage innovation, and doesn't support change have a future? The inner swords are right. Without them, with your way of thinking, external swords would have gone extinct long ago. Lu Xiaoyi said bluntly. No one would be willing to be sliced into pieces for research. What kind of spirit, what kind of body it was, what kind of growth experience it had, and what kind of martial arts system it had. Therefore, although he didn't hate seniors like Gudong, he still had to come over and express his views. Some things couldn't be avoided, and now he had the right to speak. Gudong wasn't angry, even if this disciple was rude. "Are you sure you are such a heresy?" Lu Xiaoyi shrugged. "I'm not sure, but if everyone is given the freedom to develop, there will definitely be heresy, and they won't be scared away by you. Thank the heavens, there aren't many people who think like you in the external swords. But if there comes a day when people like you become the mainstream." Gudong frowned. "You're here to express your dissatisfaction." Lu Xiaoyi didn't shy away. "Yes, in the swordsman's way. If I were a spell cultivator, I would only remember it in my heart." Both of them were stubborn. One insisted on not apologizing, while the other insisted on speaking the truth. In the end, they could only part on bad terms. Seeing this young swordsman swagger out of the sword Qi rushing heaven pavilion, Gudong was speechless. After a while, a few Jin Dan appeared beside him, and one of them was dissatisfied. "How arrogant!" Gudong sighed. "No, he's here to tell us that he already knows the opinions of the upper echelons of the sect, and to remind us not to have any ideas in this area." Xuan Yuan's management was actually very open-minded in certain aspects. For example, the lower echelons had the right to act independently in certain areas. Although the upper echelons had already reached a consensus on how to deal with Lu Xiaoyi, there was no need to make it official. Hence, there was still a lot of room for manipulation. Lu Xiaoyi's visit was actually to say that he already knew about the yuanying of the true monarch. Hence, if there were any movements in this area in the future, he had the right to refuse. He's grown up. I hope he can continue to be so. Lu Xiaoyi had arranged his cultivation perfectly this time. It was perfect because no one would disturb him. He already had the right to not be disturbed, although this right could only last for 10 years. Everyone in the Dome Peak knew that eldest senior brother was in seclusion. It was also the reason why many people wanted to train themselves. If someone as strong as eldest senior brother was working hard, what right did they have to slack off? Of course, the inner swordsmen did not think this way. They were constantly thinking about how to challenge him. They felt that this was a kind of shameless behavior. Using seclusion to prolong the time the outer swordsmen took to ride on the inner swordsmen's heads was actually just a small trick to avoid challenges. After Lu Xiaoyi's glory, he began to slowly fade into the legends of the dome. Every day, countless things would happen. Every person would have a problem that you couldn't help but care about. Every mission would have innumerable troubles. After all, he was only in the foundation establishment stage. Not to mention the outer swordsman, even Xin Yuan, the eldest senior brother of the entire Five Rings, was only in the foundation establishment stage. It was not like he could become an immortal. During this time, the Five Rings Foundation establishment leaderboard was updated several times. However, Candide Haas' ranking remained stable at 11th. It had never moved. This was the rule of the leaderboard. If one wanted to enter the top 10, they had to fight to the death with at least one of the top 10. They could not fight in the sect under the protection of their elders. This was the rule of the Five Rings. Experts in internal battles could not replace experts in external battles. If the swordsmen wanted to prove themselves, their whetstones could only be cultivators who did not have the sword vein. Chapter 405. The first day Lu Xiaoyi came out of seclusion was not his own initiative. With his character, it would be best for him to stay in seclusion for a few more days. If no one came to find him, he planned to continue like this. But there were people who remembered. Lu Xiaoyi helplessly looked at the two cultivators outside the abode. One was Guangming, and the other he did not recognize. It was understandable that they wanted to take revenge for the defeat 10 years ago, but the timing was too accurate. They really did not give him a single extra day. It seemed that this inner sword elite had not thought of anything else for the past 10 years. He had been counting the time with his fingers. Guangming bowed from afar. My apologies. My flying sword is unbearable, like a fishbone stuck in my throat. I hope you can forgive me for disturbing senior apprentice brother's cultivation. This is my martial uncle Guang Yao, who will bear witness for us. Does senior apprentice brother need to prepare? Guang Ming will be waiting here. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Of course, he had heard of Guang Yao's name. 10 years ago, he was ranked second in the Foundation Establishment ranking. Now he was ranked in the Jindan ranking. Thinking about it, it was only a matter of time before he rose to the top of the Jindan ranking. He was the true backbone of the Inner Sword's younger generation. Although he looked very ordinary, there was a sense of extraordinariness in his ordinariness. Thus, he returned the greeting. I'll trouble martial uncle to bear witness. There's no need to prepare. I can do it now. He did not request for the outer sword Jin Dan to be present. Xin Yuan's swordsmen rarely did such underhanded activities, especially the inner sword, especially above the dome. If the two of them were in danger at the same time, Guang Yao would definitely save him first, and not Guang Ming. This was respect for the sword. Otherwise, it would not be clear and cause a huge conflict between the inner and outer swords. There are some things that needed to be resolved, and not endlessly deal with these inner swords who were not convinced. The two of them faced each other in the air above the ice river. Guang Ming's battle was still very Guang Ming. He knew that Lu Xiaoyi had the advantage of being the first to attack, so he still stood 1,000 feet away, but did not approach to take advantage of him. The two of them stared at each other for several breaths of time before suddenly moving at the same time. Lu Xiaoyi moved towards Light's left side under the guidance of the starlight, while Light advanced towards him from the opposite side. This was the standard swordsman style of fighting. It was to seek an instant of collision between flying swords, and then decide on a battle strategy based on the specific circumstances of the collision. Lu Xiaoyi did not hold back. Only by defeating Guang Ming quickly and cleanly would he be able to obtain a period of peace and quiet for himself. The Four Seasons had already shot out 7,000 feet away, which had already exceeded the maximum distance he could control with his divine sense. However, if he took into account his forward momentum, he would be able to reach it when the two sides were close. Next was Zhu Cheng, and then Hidden Fragrance. They already knew each other's details, so what was the point of hiding? Light's expression did not change, but the surprise in his heart still made him very careful. 10 years ago, this external sword's range was still 500 feet, but now it had increased to 700 feet. His original shooting range was around 4,000 feet. After 10 years of hard work and receiving guidance from martial uncle Guang Yao, he could only barely raise it to 4,500 feet. However, he was not discouraged. The ability of a physical sword, including its shooting range and power, was originally above the virtual sword of an internal sword. This was a fact that could not be changed. Each had their own strengths. If the internal sword was not only fast, but also far and heavy, then there was really no need for the external sword to exist. Since it was certain that his opponent would attack first, then he would test the power of his opponent's 3 swords at once. This would provide a basis for his future battle strategy. He did not wait for the opponent's flying swords to come closer before defending. Instead, he began to intercept them at his maximum shooting range. More than 4,000 feet away, the swarm of flying swords and the Four Seasons began to collide for the first time. This was a collision between virtual and real, a collision between more and less, a collision between the Sheep Horn Force, the Blood Battle Force, the Stars Force, and the Sheep Horn Force. More than 20 collisions in a breath made the Four Seasons seem to have turned into a flaming sword. This was not its own fire attribute, but the sparks formed by the sharp weapons scraping against each other, accompanied by the ear-piercing sound of metal. How long would it take for a flying sword to fly 6,000 feet? For the Four Seasons, 6 breaths was enough. But what Light could not accept was that he had used more than 3 breaths of time and more than 60 swords to slow down the Four Seasons attack. Following that, the Four Seasons attack would enter the next weak attack after accumulating power. This situation was completely out of Light's expectations. Although there were all kinds of reasons, such as the power of his flying sword from a long distance was definitely not strong, the blood battle force could not be used, etc., but in his judgment, he could not block more than 20 or 30 swords, and this was still taking into account the increase in strength of his opponent in the past 10 years. But he could not accept that it took him more than 60 swords to block it, and also put him in a predicament the moment the battle began. There were still 2 flying swords with spirits, but he had less than 3 breaths of time left. The 3 flying swords walked the same path of the sword. It was the most basic of the external swords that continuously penetrated one point. There were no fancy moves. It was just a test of whether you could block it or not. Because the distance was close, Light's blood battle force was fully displayed. But Lu Xiaoyi's second sword was also the heaviest of all his flying swords. In order to block it, Light had to use another 50 swords, more than 2 breaths of time. In the end, there was less than half a breath of time left for Hidden Fragrance to block it. Even if Hidden Fragrance's penetrative power was the weakest of all of Lu Xiaoyi's flying swords. But that was only a limited weakness and not an essential difference. Light wanted to cry. All the preparations he had made in the past 10 years had been ruthlessly crushed in the first exchange. He had improved, but his opponent had improved even more. In the past 10 years, he had not practiced a new sword art. If he could not defeat his opponent with 100 years of sword art, what new skill could he learn in 10 years? He had put his focus on the range and sword frequency. After 10 years of hard work, under Glorious Light's guidance, the range had increased by several dozen zhong, and he had also learned Glorious Light's unique skill, controlling the sword frequency to increase and decrease. He believed that the changes in his sword frequency could destroy his opponent's defense in one fell swoop. If he had learned this move last time, he would not have lost. But what he had not expected was that his opponent would not give him a chance to attack. What did it matter if you burst or not in defense? The total amount would not change. In half a breath's time, he could not block the flying swords for several dozen zhong, even if it was the weakest Hidden Fragrance. Moreover, his opponent's first flying sword had already turned back. Even if it was only a 2-part weak sword, it was still a threat that needed to be dealt with. Light did not give up his final struggle, trying to use his flying swords and escape techniques to achieve his goal. Unfortunately, at such a close distance, how could a cultivator's escape technique be faster than a flying sword? He still had a method, which was to use Shadow Sword to teleport out. But this was like drinking poison to quench thirst. He could teleport out, but his opponent's flying sword would definitely follow. His teleportation gave him a short moment, but it also gave his opponent's flying sword a 2-part weak sword. When he appeared again, he would face the next wave of powerful attacks. It was an endless cycle. Chapter 406. The battle was over. Light illumination stopped the battle without hesitation. Sorry for the disturbance. I know you don't like challenges. From today onwards, there won't be another swordsman in the inner sword until I think he has the strength. Light illumination gave him a deep look. Good sword. Even when I was in Foundation establishment, I might not have been able to block you. In Xianyuan, the inner and outer swords counter each other. The inner sword's sword frequency is unbreakable to the outer sword. However, this is under the premise that the outer sword can't succeed in one strike. Like you, who trained the outer sword's heavy strikes to the extreme, the inner sword is also unbreakable. I hope you can continue to maintain this advantage, not only in Foundation establishment, but also in Jindan. When the time comes, I'll be looking forward to testing your heavy sword. Light illumination wasn't disappointed by the inner swordsman's failure at all. Instead, he was full of admiration. At the same time, I want to tell you, you're not only the outer sword senior brother, you're also the inner sword senior brother. When you go out and meet inner sword disciples, as long as it doesn't conflict with the sect's mission, you have the right to control them. Congratulations, you've done something that no one in Xianyuan has ever done in tens of thousands of years. Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly. Actually, I also didn't want to be the outer sword senior brother. All right, I know it's a bit pretentious to say this now. Actually, senior brother Light was just a bit careless. In close range, it's not certain who would win. Light Illumination laughed loudly. You don't have to give him face. He can't do long range, but he can't do the same in mid-range. He can't outrun you in terms of escape techniques. Furthermore, Light Illumination's gaze was like a knife, sweeping across his hand. Look at the unusually large acupoints on your hand. There are calluses growing between your thumb and index finger. For a cultivator who can control his own body, how many times does he have to swing his sword every day to grow a callus? He won't have a chance, even in close range. Seeing the outer sword leave, Light Illumination was a bit disheartened. However, he didn't complain. He wasn't strong enough, so there was nothing to say. Junior brother, are you still not convinced? Light Illumination laughed. He called him junior brother because they were close. The two of them had been guarding Xuanyuan's glory on the rankings for the past 10 years. Guangming thought for a moment. Senior brother, I admit that I'm not his opponent in long range. At most, I'll be able to attack and defend from mid-range. If I can't catch up to him, my chances of winning won't be high. But you think so highly of him, even though he's holding a sword at such a close distance. Isn't that too? Take it for granted. Guang Yao shook his head. When a swordsman wields a sword, it's not all about cultivation. All the inner swords and most of the outer swords, who didn't wield their swords more than 10,000 times a day. He rarely slacked off. This was not a competition of skills, but of insight and judgment. It was the seizing of a fleeting opportunity. It was the courage to fight for the front line. This was a kind of talent. It was something that was born with, and it wasn't something that could be made up for by swinging the sword 10,000 times a day. This cigarette, but was such a person. You carefully recall the choices he made during the inner and outer sword battles. He never made a mistake. Every choice he made was simple, direct, and straight to the core. He wasn't crippled. If you hold a sword with such a person, I won't be able to save you in an instant. You might be as fast as him, but you're definitely not as ruthless as him. He didn't know how to seize the opportunity. This isn't an exaggeration, but it's proven in these battles. Guang Yao was silent. He knew that his senior brother's words were very reasonable. During the 6 battles with the outer sword, other than the one against him, all of them were one-hit kills. This wasn't luck, but some kind of inherent certainty. Different opponents had different methods. To be able to find the right method every time was a skill that couldn't be learned. For example, in today's battle, he used the simplest of the outer sword battle system, multiple flying swords and continuous penetration of the same sword path. This was the most basic thing, an introductory lesson for every outer sword. Was it because he didn't know the other battle combinations? How was that possible? He still did it because he thought that it would be a success. In fact, he had indeed done it. Too many people would slowly find a suitable way to break through while probing. This would cause them to lose time, lose suddenness, and cause their explosive power to be exhausted. This was especially important when wielding a sword. If the opponent found a breakthrough before you, it meant that you had failed. Seeing that there was a trace of disappointment in Guang Yao's disappointment, Guang Yao understood his feelings. This junior brother of his had been under a lot of pressure ever since he advanced to Jindan. It was his first time shouldering the responsibility of Xianyuan's swordsman on the 5-ring leaderboard alone. In the past, Guang Yao was in front of him, so he didn't have to worry about anything. Now, he had to shoulder the responsibility of Xianyuan and the inner sword. He was afraid that if he wasn't careful, he would ruin the glory of the inner sword. Even though he never said it out loud, he cared about it in his heart. He didn't expect that the danger didn't come from the outside world, but from the inner sword. It was too unexpected. This kind of thing had to be handled properly. If he didn't grasp the propriety, the more radical one would lose his life, and the more cowardly one would lose his sword heart. But no matter what, his junior brother's current mental state wasn't suitable to be the leader of Xuanyuan's foundation building. He had too many worries and had a lot on his mind. Unlike that indifferent cigarette, but just now, he could see that this person didn't care about the leaderboard at all. This was a great spirit. even though it was a little lazy and indifferent. But in order not to destroy Guang Yao, he still decided to tell him some news to calm him down. After 100 years of cultivation together, they were closer than real brothers. Guang Yao wasn't suitable to shoulder the burden now. This was because of his strength and also because of fate. Perhaps if he was given more time, he would be able to do it. But now, there was no chance. Guang Yao could see clearly that Guang Yao's strength was already at his peak. If he went any further, his improvement would be limited. What he should be most concerned about now was how to advance to Jindan and not summon the wind and rain on the leaderboard. And that cigarette, but was in a state of rapid improvement. The longer this dragged on, the bigger the gap between them would be. This might not be Guang Yao's misfortune. Misfortune was a blessing in disguise, and a blessing in disguise. Without this cigarette, but he would definitely waste a lot of energy on the leaderboard and delay his real journey to the upper realm. But now he had a chance to pull his feet out of the quagmire. The key was to give him a reason to give up. He just happened to have one now. Cigarette, but strength lies in his sword spirit. This is the common view of everyone. But from what I see, what's more terrifying about him is his battle awareness. This is what most people overlook. Do you know the reason for this? Guang Yao didn't understand. What other reason could there be? Talent. Whether it was sword spirit or battle awareness, they couldn't be trained through hard work. A few days ago, I was fortunate enough to attend a private gathering of an internal sword true lord. When the gathering was over, the true lord specially asked me to take care of this external sword senior brother. Don't you think it's strange? The internal sword true lord asked his own internal sword disciple to take care of an external sword? Guang Yao also found it strange. Senior brother, what's the reason? I definitely won't divulge the true lord's words, but I'm actually hesitant now. I hope senior brother can teach me. Chapter 407. Dazzling Light said seriously. 10 years ago, our sect's Lu Zhu returned to the mountain. At that time, we didn't know about it. It was only after Lu Zhu left that we slowly found out from other channels. At that time, during the spiritual assembly on Crow Peak, there was a true monarch who questioned the ability of this cigarette, but to give birth to a sword spirit. He requested Lu Zhu to help and see if this ability could benefit the entire external sword sect. After Lu Zhu examined it, he rejected this suggestion, not only because our Xian Yuan has always abided by the rights of cultivators, but also because this cigarette is actually a reincarnated person, and it's very possible that he's the reincarnated soul of one of the great cultivators in our inner sword. Light was stunned, but he was also quick-witted. He immediately connected this statement with some news he had heard before. I understand now. No wonder when one Guangfeng was catching the sword pills all avoided him. It's the sword pill's nature to be fearless, unless they feel that this sword pill is more ferocious than them. Then this person had no choice but to go to the external sword, relying on his previous life's inexplicable ability to easily cultivate a sword spirit. He even has the battle instincts of a swordsman from his previous life. It seems like he's a great swordsman. But senior brother, there are also reincarnated souls in our Xian Yuan. Why can't others do it? But he can. Dazzling Light couldn't answer this question, because this was also his question. What he didn't know was that because the reincarnation of sword spirit was too bizarre, the true monarchs were afraid that it would cause uncontrollable harm to Lu Xiaoi. So they changed the story and said that the senior was the reincarnation of a swordsman. To the Jin Dan below, there had to be an explanation, but it wasn't easy to tell the truth, so they changed the story. There's always a chance. Maybe this senior's obsession with the sword is incomparably strong. Maybe. So junior brother, you don't have to be so concerned, because the one above you is still a soul in the inner sword. Maybe when he reaches Yuanying and becomes a true monarch, he'll remember the past. Isn't he still a member of our inner sword? I'm just afraid that you won't be able to persevere until that day, and you won't be able to see which senior is suppressing you. Well, I was relieved. I knew it. When we fight, we're suppressed everywhere. No matter what we're thinking, we'll be seen through. Was this his subconscious instinct? Senior brother, I understand what you mean. I will cooperate with eldest senior brother. In addition, to me, the most important thing now is to break through to the next realm, not to struggle on the rankings. With eldest senior brother around, it's not my turn to do anything. Radiant nodded in satisfaction. He finally understood. For inner swordsmen like them, the responsibility on their shoulders was very heavy. Generations after generations of seniors had passed down their glory, but when it came to him, it was broken. The more prideful one was, the harder it was to let go. This was the reason why he enlightened Radiant. Lu Xiaoyi wandered around outside, but he had nothing to do. In fact, if he really had a sense of responsibility, he would go to the Rising Sky Pavilion, or even find his second senior brother and the others. There were many things waiting for him. However, his philosophy was that the world of cultivation would still revolve if anyone was missing. Without him, would the sky collapse? Would Xuanyuan's life be over? If he didn't do it, someone else would. If you got involved, there would be countless troubles waiting for you. If you stayed away, someone else would take care of these troubles. Why bother getting involved? Therefore, he circled around and returned to his cave residence. When he came in, he saw more than 10 sword talismans outside the formation of his cave residence. There were talismans from the Thunder Pavilion of Wengguang Peak, talismans from the Rising Sky Pavilion of Thousand Elegance Peak, talismans from the Rising Sky Pavilion of the Rising Sky Pavilion, talismans from the Rising Sky Pavilion of the Rising Sky Pavilion, and talismans from his second senior brother and the others. What the hell? Can't I live? According to the rules, he should first go to the Sword Chi Pavilion, then the Thunder Pavilion. After all, his position in Xianyuan was unique. After that, he should go to the various palaces. As for his second senior brother and the others, they were just here to cause trouble. They had survived for 10 years. How could they not survive when he came out? However, he wasn't a person who followed the rules. He always wanted to ask for some gossip. Knowing that he couldn't escape, he wanted to see if there were really many tasks. Would he be able to get something cheap? Something easy? Laziness had already seeped into his bones and blood. As for who to look for, of course, it was Gu Gang of the Ascension Hall. Because he spoke up for justice at the Soaring Heaven Pavilion, the true monarch thought highly of his strength of character and knowledge. The old hall Master Gu, he was a little unreliable. Therefore, he had already become the boss of the Ascension Hall. He was now a person with some status among the foundation building cultivators. Therefore, he had the right to see the hall masters of the various palaces. He didn't need to wait in line. He was like a class monitor or a class representative under a homeroom teacher. Gu Gang was in the middle of dealing with all sorts of trivial matters that he had to deal with every day. Even though he was full of energy and extremely patient, there was still some irritation in his heart. Then he saw a head poking out from the side of the hall, winking there. He could only speed up and send away the disciple in front of him. He turned his head and shouted, "You are the eldest senior brother. Can you be a little more dignified? Show some poise? How can you be a role model for the 20,000 foundation building cultivators? A role model for the young disciples?" Lu Xiaoyi didn't care. He slumped in front of Gu Gang. "Martial uncle, my eldest senior brother was pushed up by others. It wasn't my wish. Why don't you find a reason to remove me?" Gu Gang didn't know what to do with his mischievous behavior. Most importantly, he knew that this kid really didn't care. He couldn't force him. "Why are you looking for me? Can't you see that I'm busy here? I don't have time to chat with you." Lu Xiaoyi was a little speechless. "Martial uncle, you're the one looking for me, not the one looking for you. Do you really think I'm willing to come to your place? This is not the Ascension Hall. It should be called the Troublesome Hall. It's better not to come here so easily." Gu Gang was busy. Secondly, he was confused by his anger. There's a mission that requires you to participate. It's a group mission. You'll lead the team. You can decide on the manpower yourself. It's like this. Lu Xiaoyi interrupted, "Wait. Martial uncle, I still have missions in Ming Chuan Hall, Dark Hall, Rising Heaven Pavilion, and even Thunder Hall has taken a fancy to me. Therefore, I really might not be able to participate in your mission. How about this? You wait for a moment, and I'll go to those places first. Don't worry, based on our relationship. If I really have to choose a mission, I'll definitely choose our Ascension Hall first. Who asked the disciples here to be so close to me? Gu Gang laughed in anger. Oh, you Lu Xiaoyi are really in high demand now. Are you going to say that you have a mission elsewhere when you're here? Go to another place and say that I have a mission here. Say that you have a mission in Thunder Hall at Rising Heaven Pavilion. Go to Thunder Hall and then push Rising Heaven Pavilion for a mission. It's best if these missions end up in someone else's hands, so you can be free. At the very least, you can choose the simplest mission. For example, go down the mountain and carry 2 loads of water. Lu Xiaoyi's thoughts were exposed. He was thick-skinned and didn't feel embarrassed in the slightest. Martial Uncle's discerning eyes are like torches, boundless and able to see through everything. You hit the nail on the head. Didn't Disciple just come here to ask around? How come it's only been 10 years and all these trivial matters have come knocking on my door? You're bullying me for being honest. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.